Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Dale Santana, but everyone calls me Mustache. I've been driving long-haul trucks across America for almost 30 years, and I've seen things on these highways that would make most people question their sanity. I'm retired now, living in Tucson, Arizona, and I finally feel comfortable sharing some experiences that have haunted me throughout my career. The first incident happened in late December of 1999. I was driving the Phoenix to Miami route, a grueling 3-day journey that tested every trucker's endurance. Back then, the sleeper cabs weren't as comfortable as today's rigs, and we'd switch drivers at designated points to keep moving. I'd picked up the rig in Phoenix at 10 p.m. and reached Atlanta by 2 p.m. the next day, where I was scheduled to take over and drive to Jacksonville, Florida, where another driver would complete the run to Miami. After greeting the passengers and explaining our route, we left Atlanta and headed southeast. Night fell quickly, and by almost midnight, I'd passed through Valdosta, Georgia. Despite the fatigue, I felt alert and focused on the dark interstate ahead. That's when I saw her. A woman appeared in my headlights, standing right in the middle of Interstate 75. Her clothes were torn and bloodied, and she was frantically waving her arms, practically throwing herself in front of my 18-wheeler. I had no choice but to hit the brakes and pull over. When I opened the door, I could see the desperation in her eyes. All 32 passengers were sound asleep, exhausted from the long journey. I activated the hazard lights and climbed down with Pete, my co-driver who handled tickets and passenger assistance, to find out what had happened. The woman was hysterical, explaining that the car she'd been traveling in with her husband had gone off the road and rolled down an embankment. Despite her injuries, she seemed relatively stable and pointed toward the wreckage below. I looked back and could still see the lights of Valdosta in the distance, which was fortunate. A pickup truck happened to pass by, and I flagged down the driver, asking him to call 911 and report the accident. Pete and I then made our way down to investigate the crash site. What we found defied all logic. There was indeed an overturned vehicle, but the woman had vanished completely. I thought maybe she'd wandered off in shock, so I illuminated the wreckage with my flashlight. Inside, I discovered 2 occupants, a man dead behind the wheel and a woman dead in the passenger seat. When I got closer to identify the woman, I nearly had a heart attack. The woman trapped in the twisted metal was the same person who had just flagged me down minutes earlier, asking for help. My legs went weak, and I felt like I might faint. I'd never seen these people before in my life. I called Pete over to confirm what I was seeing. He'd always been skeptical of supernatural things, but the adrenaline got the better of him. When he saw the dead woman's face, he let out a scream and ran up the embankment like he'd seen the devil himself. We waited on the highway until the state troopers arrived. When they asked what happened, I didn't mention the woman's plea for help. They would have thought I was crazy. Instead, I told them the car had been ahead of us and suddenly veered off the road. The officers released us, and I continued to Jacksonville, but I couldn't shake that image from my mind. The next day, driving the return route to Phoenix, that scene kept replaying in my head. Worse, I started having nightmares about the accident, always featuring that woman asking for help. The fear of having my own crash became overwhelming. I spoke with my supervisor and told him what Pete and I had witnessed. He believed me and revealed that I wasn't the first, nor would I be the last driver in the company to see such things. He explained that these encounters were more common than people realized. We just don't usually notice them. He gave me 2 weeks off to clear my head and rest. I took my wife to visit my parents in a small town outside Flagstaff, Arizona. When I told my mother what had happened, she went to see Maria, an old woman known for her spiritual healing, and they returned with herbs for me to bathe with. Maria also prayed over me and had me repeat certain prayers that she said would help those souls find peace. Then she advised me to place 2 crosses at the accident site, one for the man and one for the woman. Whether it was coincidence or not, from that day forward, I never had another nightmare about the incident. My anxiety disappeared, and I slept peacefully again. When my 2 weeks were up, I returned to work. On my first trip through that same stretch of I-75, I stopped the bus, got out, and placed those 2 wooden crosses by the roadside. I lit some candles and said a quick prayer. After that experience, I started paying closer attention to unusual details on nighttime highways. There really are inexplicable things out there that most people either don't notice or dismiss as everyday occurrences. Years later, in 2007, I changed routes but stayed with the same company, now running Phoenix to Jacksonville via Birmingham, Alabama. It was almost 1 a.m. as I passed through the mountains near Chattanooga, Tennessee, when I saw a woman who looked like a vagrant walking along the shoulder in the opposite direction. For a split second, our eyes met through the windshield. Then she suddenly leaped in front of the bus, as if trying to come through the glass, her face inches from mine. Her expression was grotesque, and something that looked like a serpent's tongue protruded from her mouth. Then she disappeared. I was shaken, but managed to reach Birmingham safely. After that episode, whenever I saw people walking along desolate stretches of highway, I'd look away and pretend I hadn't seen them. It wasn't the first time, and I learned to ignore these sightings. But the most incredible supernatural encounter happened in 2012, and I only realized what had occurred several days later. This incident was more recent and involved the Phoenix to Savannah, Georgia route. I drove to Atlanta, where another driver would complete the journey. We started the trip around 2 p.m., and it was unusually peaceful with few passengers. During a rest stop in Alabama, the passengers got off to stretch their legs. Some used the restrooms, while others grabbed quick snacks. I was sitting at a table drinking coffee when an elderly lady approached and struck up a conversation. She was incredibly friendly and talkative, introducing herself as Isabel Martinez. She said she lived in Tucson and was a widow living alone. She'd come to Phoenix to visit her son and see her newborn granddaughter. She mentioned that her daughter-in-law didn't like her much, but she'd made the trip anyway because family shouldn't hold grudges, especially when there's a new baby involved. Everything seemed perfectly normal. After our break, we got back on the bus, and I noticed Isabel had taken a seat toward the back. I continued driving to Atlanta, which was my final destination, and would return to Phoenix the next day. As was customary, I always said goodbye to passengers and wished them well for the remainder of their journey. This time was no different. Passengers began getting off for their meal break, but I noticed Isabel was missing. I initially thought she might be using the onboard restroom. After everyone had disembarked, I went back into the bus to check, but Isabel wasn't there. This struck me as very strange, so I checked the passenger manifest. I was shocked to find no record of her name. Since this was all very peculiar, I reported it to the company supervisor. He said he'd investigate and managed to find Isabel's name. But on a trip from the previous month, traveling from Tucson to Phoenix, he promised to contact the woman's family to find out what had really happened. 2 days later, he called me back. "Dale, are you sitting down? You'd better sit if you're not. Remember that Isabel Martinez you told me about?" Well, I contacted her relatives and discovered that she had indeed traveled from Tucson to Phoenix to meet her newborn granddaughter. Unfortunately, she suffered a sudden medical emergency and passed away. Since all her children and grandchildren lived in Phoenix, they held the funeral there. Since this wasn't my first supernatural encounter, I let it go. But then something unexpected began happening. For 3 consecutive nights, I dreamed about Isabel. In every dream, she told me she wanted to return home to be near her husband. I managed to get the family's contact information, arranged a meeting, and went to speak with them in person. When I told them everything that had happened and shared our conversation, the family members were moved to tears. They said they would find a way to transport her remains back to Tucson to bury her in the same plot as her husband, who had died 10 years earlier. Some people say these experiences are the enemy trying to confuse me, while others believe I have a gift for seeing and communicating with those who are no longer among the living. Either way, I live my life normally without despair, but with the conviction that after we leave this world, there's still a journey ahead of us. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Marcus Magallanes. I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska. I'm 37 years old, and I've been a long-haul trucker for 17 years. I can honestly say I've seen everything these highways have to offer. But this story I'm about to tell happened to me on the stretch of highway between Fairbanks and Prudhoe Bay about 15 years ago. I was on another routine run, loaded up in Fairbanks with supplies destined for the oil fields up north. It was around 5 in the afternoon when I started the journey, and by 3:40 in the morning, I was deep in the Alaskan wilderness. The road stretched endlessly through a landscape that seemed untouched by civilization, with nothing but pine forests and tundra on both sides. As I came around a sharp curve, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a creature standing directly in front of my 18-wheeler, arms spread wide, as if welcoming me into some kind of embrace. In that split second, I had no time to react. I couldn't brake, couldn't swerve. I went straight through it, and I swear it felt like that thing passed right through my body. Every hair on my body stood on end. My breathing became labored, but I kept driving. I had to keep moving. The isolation up here doesn't give you many options when something goes wrong. About 70 miles further down the road, in a particularly rough stretch where the permafrost had buckled the asphalt into a moonscape of potholes, I pulled over to check my load. That's when I saw it again. The same creature was standing on the running board of my truck, just staring at me through the passenger window. I made the sign of the cross and started praying, something I hadn't done since I was a kid going to church with my grandmother in Anchorage. The thing stayed there for what felt like an eternity, just watching me with eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the Arctic night. When I reached my destination that morning, I told some of the other drivers what I'd seen. Most of them just laughed it off, said it was probably just sleep deprivation or maybe a caribou that looked strange in the headlights. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered in 17 years of driving through Alaska. The thing is, I still run that same route between Fairbanks and Prudhoe Bay, and I still see things, silhouettes moving along the roadside, shadows that don't belong to anything visible. But none of them compare to the fear I felt that night in March of 2008, when something that had no business existing in this world decided to hitch a ride on my truck. The North Slope is a lonely place, especially in the dead of winter when the sun doesn't rise for months. Up there, in temperatures that can drop to 60 below zero, you start to understand that there are things in this world that don't follow the rules we're comfortable with. The old-timers who work the oil fields, they have stories too. They talk about shapes moving across the ice that disappear when you look directly at them, about sounds coming from the tundra that don't match any animal they know. I've learned to respect whatever lives up there in that frozen wilderness. When I'm driving through those endless miles of nothing, I keep my eyes on the road and my mind focused on getting from point A to point B. Because up there, where civilization is just a distant memory, and the landscape can kill you in a dozen different ways, you realize that we're not alone. And sometimes, the things that share that space with us don't appreciate visitors. But I keep driving that route because it's what I know, and it's how I make my living. Every time I pass that curve where I first saw the creature, I say a little prayer and keep my foot steady on the accelerator. Because stopping isn't an option when you're that far from help, and whatever's out there in the darkness knows it too. My name is Peter. I'm 32 years old, and I want to tell you about something that happened to me that made me reconsider everything I believe about life, death, and divine intervention. What I witnessed would make anyone analyze their actions and draw closer to God, regardless of their religion. I live in a small town in eastern Montana called Divinity, where Highway 200 cuts right through the heart of our community. Everything I'm about to tell you happened in 2019, on what started as a perfectly ordinary day with bright sunshine. My mother had undergone surgery in a town about 42 miles away, and I needed to pick her up around 6 in the evening when she was scheduled to be discharged from the hospital. It seemed like a straightforward drive. I'd made it countless times before. I left home around 6 p.m. in my pickup truck. The route between our towns includes a notorious curve that locals call Dead Man's Curve because of the tragic and violent deaths that have occurred there over the years. As darkness fell across the highway, I felt an unusual chill run down my spine. When I approached the curve, I had to slow down significantly. The county had installed 2 speed bumps in that section to prevent accidents and fatalities. I reduced my speed and crossed the first speed bump, then accelerated to take the curve. That's when something impossible happened. My truck suddenly became incredibly heavy. So heavy it felt like it was carrying 1,000 tons. I pressed the accelerator, but the vehicle wouldn't budge. I was stuck in complete darkness despite having my high beams on. In the distance, along the shoulder, I could see a young man walking slowly with his head down. He approached my truck at a deliberate pace, passed by without saying a word, and simply disappeared like smoke into the night air. Terror consumed me. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but my truck remained immobilized in that curve. When I checked my rearview mirror, I saw a car approaching at high speed. I thought this was the end for me, but the impossible happened. The vehicle passed right through my truck as if it were a ghost and vanished around the curve. I was trembling with fear and pleading with God to get me out of there. I kept pressing the accelerator frantically until finally my truck began to move slowly. Once I gained momentum, I floored it, desperate to escape that cursed curve. But as I completed the turn, another car with bright headlights came directly toward me. There was no time to react, but incredibly, it passed through my truck once again. This time, I could hear the laughter of young people echoing from inside the phantom vehicle before it disappeared into the darkness. I drove the rest of the way trembling and praying, begging God to let me reach the other town safely. When I arrived at the hospital, I found my mother in good condition and recovering well. She asked why I was shaking, and I made up some excuse about being tired. I checked us into a hotel that night, telling my mother she needed rest after her surgery. But truthfully, I was terrified of driving back through that curve in the dark. I gave her the medications she needed to take and spent hours sitting in the hotel room, replaying what had happened. The next morning, I took my truck to a mechanic to have it inspected. After examining it thoroughly, he told me the vehicle was in perfect condition. When I mentioned it had felt heavy the night before, he assured me there was nothing mechanically wrong. We had lunch, but ironically, my mother needed to return to the hospital for some test results and additional medications. As afternoon turned to evening, I remained quiet, and my mother sensed something was wrong. Finally, I decided to tell her everything that had happened. We were still at the hospital when she led me to a statue of the Virgin Mary. There, I prayed the rosary and offered prayers for the souls of the departed. We left town as night was falling, heading back home. As we approached Dead Man's Curve, I noticed a white car parked on the shoulder with hazard lights flashing and all doors open. My mother was sleeping heavily beside me. I stopped behind the vehicle and got out to ask if they needed help. A man with a beard, probably around 60 years old, approached with a radiant smile and told me everything was fine, that I could continue my journey. In that darkness, the peace emanating from this man was extraordinary, and there was tremendous security and comfort in what he told me. I returned to my truck and continued driving. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the white car was following us slowly. After we cleared the curve and I looked back again, the car had completely disappeared. My mother woke up and I told her what had just happened. She smiled knowingly and went back to sleep. We arrived home late that night and went straight to bed. That same night, I had a dream about the man who told me that God had heard my prayers and sent him to guide me safely home. I woke up the next morning to learn that a motorcyclist had failed to brake in time and died in that very curve during the night. I believe that curve is inhabited by both malevolent and benevolent spirits. Ever since that experience, I always pray and ask God and the Virgin Mary for protection before traveling. I've never had another encounter like that one. My mother is doing well, and that experience will never leave my mind. It taught me that sometimes, when we're in our darkest moments and most desperate need, help comes from places we never expected, and sometimes from people who exist beyond our understanding of this world. My name is Jean Carlos. I'm 35 years old, and I live in Green River, Wyoming. Well, I say I live there, but the truth is I have a house in town because I actually live on the highways of America, in truck stops and company yards. I've been a trucker since I turned 20, and this is how I survive. My father was also a trucker, and it was from him that I learned to drive and inherited my love for the open road. But there's another side to trucking that few people know about or believe in. The apparitions you encounter on roadside shoulders, especially during the early morning hours when fatigue sets in and exhaustion takes hold. Many of the things we see get dismissed as tricks of the mind, whether from tiredness or accusations of using stimulants or drugs. But in 2015, during a single night, my co-driver Geraldo, better known as Ratchet, and I encountered not one but two supernatural situations. I was engaged at the time, so I wasn't turning down any work. In March of that year, I accepted a freight job from Green River to Los Angeles. I left Green River on March 25th around 5 in the morning, and it turned into a long, exhausting journey with multiple setbacks, rain, accidents, and to make matters worse, a blown tire. I finally reached Los Angeles in the early hours of March 26th, a Thursday. During the morning, I unloaded my cargo, but before heading home, a friend contacted me asking if I wanted to haul a load of rice to Little Rock, Arkansas. I was initially reluctant to take the job, but I called my father, and he told me I should accept because the freight rate was quite high. I spent part of the day resting at a friend's house, and around 4 p.m., Ratchet and I hit the highway for what would be more than 1,500 miles of driving. I drove until just after midnight, reaching Salt Lake City, where I parked at a truck stop to get some sleep before continuing the next day. When dawn broke, we had our coffee and got the truck rolling. We only stopped for lunch and fuel, but unlike other trips, I felt unusually tired and had a bad feeling, as if something dangerous might happen to us. I even considered going back to Green River and asking my father or brother Alton to take the load. It would have been about 200 extra miles, but Ratchet told me not to worry, he'd drive some stretches. He was actually a decent driver. The problem was he didn't have a CDL license. If the highway patrol caught us, I'd be the one facing sanctions. We decided to press on, and around 11 p.m., we reached Grand Junction, Colorado. At this point, Little Rock was getting closer. Actually, we still had more than 600 miles to go, but we could make it in 1 or 2 days, depending on how tired we got. Once again, we slept in a truck stop parking lot, and the next day, well before dawn, we hit the road. I managed to drive until we reached Amarillo, Texas, and when we arrived there, it was already night. We were now only about 120 miles from our destination. My body and mind were at their limits. I stopped at a truck stop and planned to spend the day resting, only starting the return journey when night fell. During this time, the cargo owner made me a proposal. Since I'd have to return to Green River anyway, he asked if I could take a load of feed to a ranch he owned in the Texarkana area. From there, I'd pass through Oklahoma, which would be on my way home. And since the distance between routes wouldn't be much different, I accepted the freight. But Samuel, the cargo owner, said, "Today you stay here in Little Rock. I'll recommend a hotel, and don't worry about the cost. Accommodation will be on me. Tomorrow you travel." I accepted the invitation, and Ratchet and I spent the day and night at the hotel, resting for the next day's journey. The following day, early in the morning, we left Little Rock heading toward Texarkana. We arrived in the early evening, and someone was already waiting to guide us to the ranch. The man was quite jovial and called himself Louis. The ranch was close to town, less than 20 miles away. As soon as we arrived, the workers quickly unloaded all the cargo. Louis, who was the manager, offered us accommodation, but I really wanted to get home. I asked if Ratchet could handle driving for a while so I could rest, and he said yes. We decided to continue our journey. Louis showed us a shortcut that would reduce our trip by about 30 miles. According to him, we just follow a county road that would bring us out well ahead without having to backtrack. I asked about the road conditions, whether it was good or full of potholes. That's when Tony, one of the employees, warned us, "The road is good, but I wouldn't trust it. I don't have the courage to travel on it even during the day, let alone at this hour." I asked if it was dangerous, thinking about robberies, but he said it was worse. That road was known for ghostly apparitions. Louis just laughed and said it was nonsense that people made up, that he'd never seen anything himself. Since I'd never been one to believe in that sort of thing, I decided to take the shortcut. We got in the truck and began our journey after midnight. After driving for several miles, I confirmed that the road was enough to give anyone the creeps, no matter how brave they might be. It was narrow with forest on both sides and total darkness. After about 20 minutes, I saw something unexpected. A family was walking in the same direction we were traveling. When my headlights illuminated them, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I asked if Ratchet was seeing it too, and he confirmed he was. I stopped a little ahead as the man approached, and I asked where they were going at that hour. He told me he lived further down the road, so I told them to climb into the truck. It was a man, a woman, and 2 children who appeared to be about 10 years old. We traveled for about 10 miles when there was a knock on the roof of the cab. Ratchet slowed down and stopped in front of a crossroads. The man indicated that his house was down a road to the right. I don't know why, but instead of just dropping them off there, I decided to take them all the way home. We continued driving and soon arrived in front of a gate. The family got out and invited us to come in and spend the night. I thanked them for the invitation, but said I wanted to continue the journey. However, when we tried to start the truck, it wouldn't turn over. We tried several times, but couldn't get it started. Then we saw some lights and heard voices of people coming down the road in our direction. I'd never seen anything like it, so I asked what it was. The man told us, "If I tell you, you won't believe me, but we'd better go inside." I'll explain later. I could see he was nervous, and the best thing to do was obey. Ratchet and I locked the truck doors and followed them into their house. As soon as we entered, the man closed the door, put out the oil lamp, and we all fell completely silent. This was strange, and curiosity got the better of me. I tried to peer through the window cracks to see what was happening outside. Honestly, I should have stayed in my corner, because what passed in front of us was the infamous procession of the dead. At least that's what they called it. There were various figures that resembled people, apparently writhing in agony, carrying what looked like lit candles that illuminated the entire road. By the light of the candles, you could see them moving, but incredibly, they didn't touch the ground. These creatures were emitting lamentations, and the whole scene was already macabre enough. To complete the horror, right behind them was a creature mounted on some black, hairy animal that resembled a horse, but was smaller and longer. When it reached exactly in front of the house where we were hiding, it stopped and stared for a moment in our direction. I don't know how, but Ratchet couldn't stand the fear anymore. The family remained silent until those creatures passed and disappeared into the darkness of the night. The homeowner lit the oil lamp, went to a water pot in the kitchen, and brought us some water so we could calm down. At this point, I had no strength left because the fear I experienced was the greatest of my entire life. After we drank water and calmed down, Ratchet said he wanted to leave no matter what. The homeowner insisted that we stay and spend the night at their house, but I also wanted to get out of that place. I couldn't understand how anyone could live in such a place, with something like that passing just meters from their house. We returned to the truck, and thank God, we got it started. The homeowner thanked us for the ride and warned us to be careful and not stop again until we reached the main highway. We continued our journey, but when we reached the crossroads, we heard a strange noise at the edge of the road. Ratchet kept the truck moving, but due to road conditions, he couldn't increase speed much. Then we heard what sounded like moaning and growling on top of the trailer. I began to pray and ask God to deliver us from that evil. It wasn't long before we started hearing the noises very close to the cab. You have no idea how much fear I experienced at that moment. Even so, we stayed strong, and the thing continued its harassment. We drove for about another hour when we saw headlights ahead, and it gave me hope knowing we were getting off that county road and approaching the main highway. At that moment, the thing that was on top of the trailer jumped to the ground and continued running alongside my side of the truck. It seemed like that demon was enjoying itself by doing these things. I looked outside, and despite the darkness, I could see a creature that resembled a deformed man mounted on an animal I had no reference for. It was smaller than a horse, but its eyes glowed intensely, and I concluded it was the same thing that had led the souls when it passed in front of the house where we were hiding. Thank God that thing stopped, and we continued our journey. We only stopped much later near Denver, and then I drove straight home. The next day, I told my parents about what had happened. My mother told me that from the moment I left for Lowe's Angels the week before, she'd felt a tightness in her chest and also had the sensation that something bad would happen. Since I had contact with the ranch people, I called Louis and told him what had happened. He remained skeptical, thinking I was making up stories, but he passed the phone to Tony, who believed everything I told him. However, he mentioned there was something strange about the story that he'd investigate and get back to me. 2 days later, I received a photo of an old, abandoned house. Looking closely, it resembled the house where Ratchet and I had hidden. Louis sent the photo and told me that the only house in the direction of that crossroads was the one in the picture, and that it had been uninhabited for many years. There wasn't even a door on the house. After that, I became even more confused and wondered whether the house was real or if Louis was playing a joke on me. These are things that happen, and few people believe them. Sometimes we experience situations that we prefer to keep quiet about to avoid being seen as crazy or a liar. Anyone who goes through a supernatural experience knows that more difficult than facing that fear is dealing with people's disbelief. I'll identify myself only as Bill. I live in Millfield, Ohio, and I work in alternative passenger transportation. After many years of driving for other people, I managed to fulfill my dream. I financed and bought a Mercedes Sprinter van, and with it, I support my family by doing freight jobs, excursions, and even medium-distance trips. In 2012, some people from Vinton County contacted me to take them to Columbus. As agreed, I only needed to transport and drop them off, since they would spend several days in the city. On September 6th, a Thursday, I left my town around 10 in the morning, and by approximately noon, I'd reached the pickup location. Some passengers were already waiting, while others arrived gradually. Soon everyone was ready for the trip. At exactly 12 o'clock, they got into the van, and after they were settled, we departed for Columbus. The trip was quite peaceful, but I drove a bit slowly and cautiously. Around 7 in the evening, we reached our destination, and they disembarked. I thanked them, and immediately began the return trip to Millfield. Right after leaving Columbus, I stopped at a gas station to fuel up and grab a quick bite, since I had another group to transport the next day to Portsmouth. After traveling more than half the route, and already having left Franklin County and entered Ross County, somewhere between Chillicothe and Waverly, near the access road to Locust Grove, a truck coming from the opposite direction passed me with high beams on, nearly blinding me and almost causing me to roll the van. I significantly reduced speed and saw a light ahead on the side of the road. When I got closer, I discovered there were several people standing in front of what appeared to be a farm entrance, apparently waiting for some kind of transportation or bus. Given the late hour, I found it very strange that they were there. Even so, I slowed down further. Right away, I figured it wasn't a robbery because I could identify children in the group, a horse tied to a post, and a gas lantern hanging from a tree next to the gate. Despite finding their presence odd at that hour, I pulled my van over to where they were standing and asked where they were going. A man approached and told me they wanted to go to a farm located past Locust Grove, a district near Waverly. I looked carefully and quickly counted. noticing the group had 12 people. 4 children, 2 younger couples who I assumed were the children's parents, 2 girls who appeared to be about 15 years old, and an elderly couple. I asked if all of them were going to Locust Grove, but the man told me only 10 would go, since the parents would stay at the local farm. Locust Grove was only a few miles away. Seeing this as extra money that would help pay for the van's expenses, I agreed to take them. I got out of the van and opened the door, and they began getting in. After everyone was inside, I started the engine, and when I went to pull away, I noticed that the horse and the elderly couple were no longer there. I couldn't see the lantern's glow either. A chill ran down my spine, but I decided to let it go. During the few miles, I turned on the radio and tried to make conversation, but the man sitting up front with me only answered what I asked him. I could see he was a man of few words, so I decided to just drive the rest of the way in relative silence. We quickly reached Locust Grove, and I asked where they'd be staying. The man told me it was a bit further ahead, so I continued down a dirt road with no lighting that was quite narrow, but fortunately not full of potholes. About 20 minutes later, the man said this was the place. When I looked, we were in front of a gate that appeared to belong to a farm or homestead. I stopped the van and got out to open the door. But to my surprise and panic, when I opened the door, there was no one inside. I immediately looked toward the front passenger seat. No one there either. All those people had simply vanished, as if they'd never been there. I didn't know whether to cry, run, stay, or just get in the van and leave. I was simply bewildered, not knowing what to do. That's when I heard a dog barking, and when I looked, I saw a house on the other side of the gate. In my desperation and fear, I went through the gate and ran toward the house, shouting and asking for help. When I was almost at the front door, a light came on, and shortly after, a man of about 60 years old came out and asked what was happening. I asked for some water, and he invited me inside. He went to the kitchen and brought me a glass of water. After I calmed down a bit, I managed to tell him what had just happened. Judging by his reaction, he either believed everything I said or was pretending very well. He told me that this sort of thing happened from time to time, and it would be better if I spent the night at their house and continued my journey the next day. Then a woman who appeared to be about the same age as the man joined us and sat talking with me, trying to keep me calm. I don't know why, but I felt safe in the presence of these 2 people. The house also had a sweet, pleasant smell that I can't explain. During our conversation, the man told me he was a doctor. He got up and returned with some medication, saying it would help me sleep peacefully. Incredibly, I simply took the medicine without questioning it. It was as if I were in the presence of someone I trusted completely. He approached me and asked me to lie down on the sofa, then began passing his hands over my body without actually touching me. When he reached my abdomen, he told me I should take better care of my liver. How he knew this just by passing his hand over me, as if feeling my energy, I have no idea. But I told him that when I got back home, I'd see a doctor. The woman brought a sheet, and I settled on the living room sofa, gradually falling asleep. What happened from that point on also has no explanation, because I felt the man's hand on my stomach. The sensation was that I was anesthetized. I felt warmth coming from his hands. It was really very hot, but all that heat didn't cause me any pain. After several minutes, he said goodbye and left me alone in the living room. Gradually, everything became strange, and suddenly I heard someone calling me. "Hey, friend, good morning. Are you okay?" When I opened my eyes, I was sitting in the driver's seat, leaning over the steering wheel. When I looked around, I was already in the parking lot of a gas station in Wilmington, a town near Millfield. I asked the name of the young man who woke me up. He said his name was Pedro, and that he was an attendant at the station. When I got my bearings, I realized I was practically home. I had no memory of anything, no idea how I'd ended up there. I didn't say anything to Pedro, but I felt a chill and began sweating cold. He noticed something was wrong with me and asked if I was feeling sick. I said no, got out of the vehicle, and went to the snack bar to have some coffee before heading to my town. I arrived home to find my wife worried sick. I was torn about whether I should tell her what had happened, but I was afraid she wouldn't believe me or would think I'd had some kind of hallucination. So I preferred to say I was very tired and had stopped to rest and ended up falling asleep. Since I was exhausted, I asked my brother-in-law to take the group on their excursion, and I took the rest of the day to rest. I woke up in the hospital with my wife by my side. I asked what had happened, and she told me I'd passed out. They ran some tests and didn't find any problems, but they asked where I'd had surgery. I told them I'd never been operated on. The doctor looked at me and said, "What do you mean?" "Of course you have." In any case, he said I'd stay in the hospital that night, and they'd run more tests the next day before discharging me. During the night, I woke up and saw my wife sleeping in the chair beside me. I don't know the exact time, but an elderly doctor entered the room and said he was going to examine me. The strange thing was that he called me by my nickname, and I began to smell the same scent I'd experienced inside the elderly couple's house. The doctor didn't have any instruments. He just touched me, then placed one hand over the other and put them on my stomach. Afterward, he said I was fine. The next day, early in the morning, a nurse came by and took me for more tests. Thank God they found nothing wrong. The following month, I tried to find the house, but I spent an entire day searching and found nothing. I couldn't even recognize the road. After that incident, I changed my way of looking at the world, and many questions remained unanswered. To be honest, I don't care to discover the answers because I know what happened, and that's enough for me. But the most impressive thing was how I managed to reach that gas station without causing an accident, and who were the people who got into my van. My name is Raphael, and I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me several years ago here in Riverside County, California, in an area called Paradise Falls. Even today, it's more of a rural region than urban dirt roads, open drainage ditches, and one of those many forgotten neighborhoods that local government has overlooked. For adults, entertainment meant either going to downtown Riverside or visiting the various bars in our poor area. But for us teenagers back then, and I believe for kids even today, the best attraction was Crystal Lake. If you look it up online, you'll see why it's called that. It really is beautiful. With white sand and water so clear, it has a blue tint that makes it look like an oasis. People swim there, ride jet skis, and it's basically a recreational spot for everyone. To get there from my house required walking several miles down what could turn a joyful trip into a nightmare, and a trauma you could carry for the rest of your life. Back then, my friend Clayton and I were inseparable. We did almost everything together, including finding girlfriends. We'd go out at night, have a few beers, and most of the time we'd meet some girls to hang out with until it was time to go home. For these adventures, we'd always go downtown since that's where we studied and worked. We'd head to Crystal Lake on weekends and holidays when it was more crowded, and lots of attractive girls from other parts of Southern California would come to check out the area. During the walk there, we'd always joke about scary situations we might encounter on the way, since the path was so long and eerie. We really just wanted to break the silence on that dirt road, surrounded by tall brush. I remember that at the time, the government was building the highway that cuts through our neighborhood. Today it's completed. This construction was the only thing different about our route. And of course, occasionally a car would pass going one way or another, always kicking up lots of dust and making us choke and cough. Despite the difficulties getting there, we always tried to return well before dark to avoid scares on the way back home along that dirt road, where we'd always heard ridiculous stories about hauntings and things like that. I remember that a few days before the incident I'm about to tell you, a couple decided to stay at Crystal Lake until later than usual. They stopped at my house asking for water for their car's radiator because it had overheated or something like that. The man was trembling like a leaf and appeared very nervous. When my mother asked if something had happened, he said we wouldn't believe them. My mother ran and got a glass of water with sugar for the man and asked him to calm down. However, he took the glass and brought it to the woman who was in the car, crying hysterically. Then he began to tell his story. I was coming to get on the main road when the car started overheating. I stopped to see what was wrong with the engine, opened the hood, and used my cell phone flashlight to see that there was no water in the reservoir. I took a 2-liter bottle of water I had in the car and put it in the reservoir. When I finished, I heard a noise behind me, something that made a very loud snorting sound. I looked and thought it was a calf lying by the roadside. I closed the hood and started the car. When I turned on the headlights again, I could see it wasn't a calf at all. It was some bizarre creature that bared enormous teeth at us. I switched to high beams and accelerated to pass by it. That's when the thing stood up like a man and gave a powerful blow to the rear side of the car. The man finished his account by showing us the damaged area caused by the supposed beast. If it weren't for the woman's desperation, I might have even laughed and said he was pulling our leg. But seeing their reactions left me somewhat surprised. The next day, on the way to school, I told my friend Clayton what had happened the night before. The jerk burst out laughing and said I was messing with him. I got really angry, but over time I started finding it funny too, since I'd never let something like that come between us. We'd been playing together since we were 5 years old and were practically inseparable. One day he told me he'd met a girl at work and was dating her. Her name was Isabel. She was from Riverside and she had a beautiful cousin. He'd arranged a meeting for the following Friday downtown, and if I didn't go, he'd kill me. I was reluctant, saying my paycheck wouldn't come until the following week, but he looked at me angrily and said, You want me to kill you now or later? Go take a shower so we can go. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. What are you turning into? That Friday we went to the meeting. The conversation went well, and when the girls arrived and I saw the girl I was supposed to meet, my eyes lit up. Everyone immediately noticed. Her name was Isabella, and when she saw my reaction, she gave me a smile that seemed angelic. She was beautiful, and we fell in love that day, becoming a lovely couple. Clayton, when we were alone, would tease me saying, "You lucked out, Marcus," and I'd just respond with a look of happiness. That day was one of the best of my life. Besides having a lot of fun as couples, I met the woman who today is the mother of my 2 beautiful children, and whom I love very much. We have a wonderful family. Time passed, and one day I went to meet Isabella's parents and also brought her to meet mine. Each day I fell more in love. I was so smitten that for a while I even distanced myself from my best friend, but not for long. One Saturday, I woke up early to a beautiful, sunny day perfect for good swimming and having a few beers. Nothing better than doing that with your best friend. I went to his house, woke him up, and we hit the road toward Crystal Lake. Just the 2 of us and God. We had a lot of fun, and I confess that day there were some girls flirting with me. But as I said, my heart already had an owner. Clayton told me that day was just ours. We had some beers, but we talked more than we drank. The day was so beautiful and pleasant that we didn't notice late afternoon approaching with all our fun. I remember my watch showed 5:45 when we decided to head home. Night would fall soon, and the walk on the dirt road was quite long and scary. But a beautiful full moon lit the road well. Cars were still passing, visitors from other places wanting to see that paradise. But soon night took over the road, illuminated only by the imposing moon. Cars no longer passed, and it was just the 2 of us on that long walk. Halfway down the road, we saw the silhouette of a person coming down the road, getting closer. Suddenly it stopped. It was a man who stood there watching us. "Who could that weirdo be?" said Clayton, smiling. Clayton pulled out his cell phone and turned on the flashlight to see what we were dealing with. When the man saw the light, he ran and plunged into the brush. I shouted, "Hello. Is everything okay?" No one answered. Clayton said we should each grab a stick in case it was a robbery. It was just him against the 2 of us. He said when we reached the spot where the man had entered the brush, we should run. That's what we did. You know how young guys are. Curiosity always wins out. We stopped in front of where the man had entered the brush and shone the cell phone light. We saw only the silhouette of that man in the tall grass, and you could see 2 little balls like marbles that seemed to be the man's eyes, moving a lot. We began to hear moaning and branches breaking. Suddenly, a terrifying howl erupted, and that's when we ran. We ran harder than we had in a long time, all the way to my front gate where there was lighting. Then we felt safer and caught our breath, totally winded. It was just a scare. Later, we were laughing about it. On Sunday around 10 in the morning, Clayton came to my house to tell me some news. His older brother had a car and would let Clayton use it. He'd called Isabel, and she and Isabella would come to go to Crystal Lake with us by car. I was also very happy because I could be with the woman I loved. We went to his house, got the car from the garage, and went to the edge of the main road to pick up the girls at the bus stop as we'd arranged over the phone. On the way, he told me, "Dude, today we're going to seal the deal," showing me 2 packs of condoms. He'd always been the mastermind of our adventures, and this day was no different. We picked up the girls, greeted them, and headed toward Crystal Lake. By car, it was much faster. In minutes, we were there. Upon arrival, the girls got situated and put down their towels to catch some rays from that blazing sun. We went to a small vendor there and bought chicken and some drinks for all 4 of us to share. On the way back, Clayton said, "Dude, the setup is simple. We don't have to leave early. We'll get with them right here like many couples do. Just don't mess it up." I asked him about what we'd seen the other day, and he said that now we had a car. Nothing was faster than that. Just step on the gas for anything strange on the way back. I nodded in agreement, thinking to myself, what could go wrong? The car was quite new, and for anything strange on the return trip, we'd just floor it and be home quickly. The day couldn't have been better, and the night was even better. It was our first night of love, both hers and mine. She was my first woman, and I was her first man. We made love right there on the towel under the light of that beautiful moon, which wasn't full but with the clear sky. It lit everything well. Clayton and Isabel went to the car and had their romantic time there. At 11 o'clock, we got in the car and the 2 of them fell asleep. I woke them up and we hit the road home. Clayton would sleep at my house, since his parents and siblings had traveled and would only return Monday afternoon. The trip was peaceful, and with those headlights, you could see everything on the road. Clayton turned the radio to full volume, and we all started singing the songs that played, wild with happiness. That is, until we reached that place from the night before, the scene of our scare. I reduced speed a bit to see if I could spot anything around there. I didn't see anything. Suddenly, the car started slowing down until it died completely. "Oh, that's exciting. But now you can start this thing and let's get going," my friend Clayton said. I hadn't done anything. It really had died. I tried to start it, but it wouldn't turn over. We began hearing noise in the brush beside us, as if something was moving stealthily. I took my friend's cell phone and popped the hood. Everything looked fine. I couldn't see any defect. I examined everything since I worked with natural gas installation and had good knowledge of mechanics, but nothing was wrong. Everything was in order. The brush began moving violently, and we began to see that abomination. A large black creature with glowing eyes that was slowly approaching us on all 4s. Seeing its size and hearing the terrifying sounds it made, I closed the hood and got in the vehicle running, engaging the electric locks on all 4 doors. That's when the idiot Clayton had the brilliant idea of shining the flashlight in the creature's face. The thing was ugly, deformed, horrible. It got irritated, stood up, and let out a howl that deafened us. Then it began attacking the car's body with such force that it would be a matter of time before it tore through the metal like paper. I took Clayton's phone, lit up the gas system control box, and noticed that one of the wires was out of its socket. It must have gotten bumped by our knees, since the little box was poorly installed. I put the wire back in place, and the car finally started. I peeled out of there, leaving that thing behind. It chased us for a bit, but then stopped. Through the mirror, I looked at my beloved and asked if she was okay. She told me that thing was a werewolf. Her aunt had told her about such things, and it matched the descriptions. When we got to my house, we locked everything up, and Clayton released the dogs into the yard. From there, we could still hear the terrifying howls that probably came from that creature. My wife is my greatest memory of that night of terror, and it was also what marked our lives. That experience bound us together forever. Strange things happen on American highways, especially those with a history of accidents and supernatural apparitions. These manifestations usually occur during the early morning hours, and most of the time, these phenomena are mistaken for hallucinations caused by fatigue or the use of hallucinogenic substances. However, I'm going to share some experiences I've had traveling the highways of our country, some that left my hair standing on end, others that initially frightened me, but later brought me a sense of peace. Before I begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Gabriel. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and I've been a trucker since I was very young. My first job was with a small moving company based in Detroit, and back then, most of the trips we made were within the state of Michigan. That changed in 2010, when I was assigned to handle a family's move from Detroit to a town called Clarksdale in Mississippi. On August 2nd, around 8 in the morning, my helper Titus and I left Detroit heading south. Around 11 that night, we reached a town called Cairo, Illinois. Even though I'd been driving all day, I felt good. I wasn't sleepy or tired, but I was very hungry. So I stopped at a truck stop for a quick meal and to use the restroom. Titus asked if we'd spend the night there. I told him I'd drive a little more, and when I got sleepy, we'd stop to rest. Half an hour later, we continued our journey. After passing through a town called Sikeston, Missouri, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw a truck approaching at high speed. It was an old-style truck with a flatbed cage set up, like those old prison transport vehicles. When the truck passed me, I could see there were several people sitting on improvised benches in the back. Among the people, I noticed some women wearing veils, and there seemed to be some kind of light inside the cage. My friend Titus was sleeping and didn't see it, but I woke him up. Still drowsy, he asked what had happened. I told him about the truck, and when I looked ahead again, I couldn't see anything in front of us. He asked what truck, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I figured I must be seeing things due to fatigue. I drove for several more miles, and out of nowhere, the truck appeared in front of me again. I called my friend Titus, but he couldn't see it. Faced with this confusion, I decided to stop at the first truck stop I found. After a few minutes, I finally reached a town called New Madrid, Missouri. I parked in the truck stop lot and got out to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. There were already other truckers stopped there. I approached them and started a conversation. I told them about what I'd seen, and one of the truckers laughed and told me it was common. He'd seen it several times himself. These apparitions happened due to the pilgrimage to the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis. He explained that if I paid attention on that stretch of highway, I'd probably see other things. I was doubtful, but I decided to take the risk and continue traveling since I was almost at my destination. That was my mistake. Right after leaving the town, I inexplicably began to feel like I was in some kind of trance. I started seeing translucent creatures that resembled people walking in procession across the highway. Some carried candles, and others appeared to be mounted on horses. I also saw people walking on their knees. When dawn broke, I reached my destination, and around 10 in the morning, I'd already delivered the move and was ready to return. But I thought it was better to stop and rest. I rented a room at a truck stop motel and slept until evening. On the return trip to Detroit, everything went smoothly without scares or apparitions. But that first experience was quite terrifying. Time passed, I changed companies, but continued in the profession, because this was what I'd chosen for my life. However, from time to time during the early morning hours, I'd see things that were at least strange or inexplicable. In 2015, I started working for the company where I currently work, and my route is between Detroit and Atlanta, Georgia. On one of these trips, something surprising happened. It's a short route, and I travel alone. That day, I left Detroit around 8 in the morning, but due to heavy, rainy traffic, the trip was very delayed. Around 7 in the evening, I was still passing through Macon, Georgia. That day, I was quite tired, so I stopped at a truck stop and took the opportunity to shower, have dinner, and rest before continuing my journey. As I was leaving the truck stop, I encountered a woman with a baby in her arms standing by the roadside. I know company policy prohibits hitchhikers, but my heart was moved seeing that woman and her child in the rain. So I decided to stop and find out where she was going. I opened the door and asked where she was headed at that hour. She told me she was going to the Macon area. Since that city was on my route, I told her to get in the cab, and I'd take her and the child there. The strange thing was that the woman didn't speak at all. She seemed mute, and the child didn't make any sound either. However, what struck me was a sweet scent of roses, and the fact that her clothes seemed old-fashioned, from another era, but well-preserved as if they were new. Since I'd already seen some things on the highway, I felt chills and then became tense. But as much as possible, I kept calm and tried to make conversation. She limited herself to responding with few words, speaking only when necessary. At this point, I didn't know what to do anymore. Fortunately, I reached the pilot truck stop. I stopped the truck, got out, opened the door, and said I'd be there for a while. The woman also got out and immediately left my field of vision. After about 10 minutes, I looked around and didn't see the woman nearby. Without thinking much about it, I got in the truck and continued my journey, relieved. But I wasn't relieved for long, because I began to smell roses again. At first, I thought the scent had lingered in the cab. A short time later, I heard children's sounds. Feeling the rose scent and hearing those sounds was spine-chilling. But suddenly, everything went quiet. My tranquility was short-lived, because when I looked to the right, the woman was sitting next to me. If I was already scared, at that moment, I almost lost control of the truck. But I couldn't stop and continued driving with my eyes fixed on the road, not wanting to look sideways. I just prayed and trembled, but I took action, and when I looked, she wasn't there anymore. I asked for God's protection and kept driving, but suddenly, I felt the passenger seat move as if someone had sat there, though I still couldn't see the woman. Even without seeing her, I could feel her presence. I remained firm, or rather, scared to death, but I knew it was only a few more miles. The worst part was when I heard a child's piercing cry inside the cab. However, the entity that barely spoke began singing a lullaby like a mother does to calm her children, and the child's crying stopped. I can't explain what happened to me, but the fear began to fade. When I looked to the side, I saw the woman sitting there again. I kept driving for several more miles, and when I was near the entrance to the town of Cordell, I looked to the side, and the woman was no longer with me. I stopped the truck to catch my breath, put my head on the steering wheel for a few seconds, and when I looked up, I saw the woman walking toward the town, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I continued driving and finally reached Atlanta. I went to sleep and rest because the previous night had been quite eventful. After that incident, I came to understand that not all entities are evil or want to attack us. If that entity, that woman, call her what you will, had wanted to harm me, she would have done so. These were my two accounts. Thank you for listening. My name is Cesar Antonio, and I'm originally from Barstow, a small town in California's Mojave Desert. Several years ago, I moved to Riverside to attend law school, and after completing my degree, I stayed here to work at a law firm. Many of my friends and family still live in Barstow or the surrounding area, and whenever I have time off, I go back to visit them. In 2016, a childhood friend invited me to be the godfather at his wedding. It was really more of a summons that I accepted with pleasure, since this friend is like a brother to me, and also because this wedding had been long awaited. He'd been with his fiancée for almost 10 years. The wedding took place on Saturday, August 13th at night. Since the two cities are quite close, about 43 miles apart, my wife and I traveled to Barstow on Friday night, and the next day we visited some friends, and I took the opportunity to rest. The wedding was at night, and on Sunday, the bride's father threw a barbecue at his property in the rural area of the county, since the newlyweds would only leave for their honeymoon on Monday. The ceremony was beautiful, and afterward there was a party that lasted until dawn. On Sunday morning, after I woke up, I went straight to the ranch where the fun continued. Since I'm a beer enthusiast, I kept drinking without worrying about it, and time passed. When night fell, I said goodbye to the friends who were there and returned to town. Arriving in Barstow, I stayed a bit longer at my family's house, and around 9 at night, I prepared to return to Riverside. As I was leaving, my mother told me she had a bad feeling. She asked me to stay there, according to her. It would be better if I spent the night and left early the next day. If it were up to me, I would have stayed. But Keisha, my wife, preferred to return to Riverside that night since she still had to prepare materials for work the next day. She thought my mother was worried, thinking I'd drive drunk, so Keisha calmed my mother down by saying she'd be the driver. Even though it went against my mother's wishes, I said goodbye to her, my father, my brothers, and some nephews, and we began the return trip. I sat in the passenger seat while Keisha drove the car. However, before completing 10 miles, I passed out because I was tired and under the influence of alcohol. We took State Route 117. I don't know how long I dozed off. I only know I woke up to a scream and the sound of braking. When I opened my eyes, the car was off the highway, and my wife was trembling with her eyes bulging, not making any sense. I asked what had happened, and she kept telling me she'd killed the woman. I asked what woman, and she, in a state of shock, couldn't explain anything to me. We got out of the car, and I didn't see any dents or signs of an accident. I also looked around, and there was nothing and no one there. My wife remained very nervous, but gradually she calmed down and was finally able to tell me that a strange woman had thrown herself in front of the car. I even joked with her, saying I'd been drinking all day and she was the one seeing things. She said it wasn't funny at all, but gave a smile and began to relax. Suddenly, she screamed again and began to tremble. I asked what was happening, and she pointed toward the road and began saying, "Look there ahead, the woman." It was her who threw herself in front of the car. Up to that moment, I hadn't been able to see anything abnormal. However, in any case, I turned on my cell phone flashlight. Although it didn't illuminate very far, I could see what was around us and further ahead on the road. I continued not seeing anyone, but given Keisha's panic, I sensed there was something on that highway. I kept trying to calm her down until I heard laughter, or at least that's what it seemed like. However, I couldn't see where the sound came from. At that moment, we both got in the car, and it even seemed like the alcohol had disappeared from my system. I put the car in reverse, and when I got the car back on the highway, I noticed there was movement of something coming in our direction. When I looked in the rearview mirror, a hideous figure was approaching the car. It appeared to be a woman, but it was certainly some kind of evil entity. I tried to accelerate, but the car seemed tied down or heavy. Probably when it went off the road, something had broken. I still managed to drive for a certain distance, but a few yards ahead, the car stopped completely. My wife was panicking, and I was also very scared. However, I tried to maintain my composure, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, that creature was walking in our direction. The only thing I thought of was to get out of the car and run to ask for help at some house by the roadside. My wife and I ran without knowing where, but thank God, shortly after, we saw some lights ahead. It was a relief, but the worst part was that the creature continued following us. We ran and saw some lights coming from a house that seemed to be a farm or something like that. When we reached the front gate, we shouted desperately, and after some time a door opened and a man came out. I don't know what he thought we wanted, so I said we needed help. He hesitated a bit, but decided to come to the gate, unlocked the padlock, and told us to come in. At that point, both Keisha and I were breathless and could barely speak. He invited us to his house, which was quite simple but welcoming. Inside were his wife and 2 teenage children. Now calmer, we told them what had happened to us. The man's name was Fernando, and he said that on that stretch of highway, strange things happened from time to time. He himself had once been returning home on his motorcycle when he felt a weight and coldness behind him. He didn't look back, but he felt breathing at his ear. While we were talking, a wind started up, and suddenly we began to hear a sound that resembled a child's crying. Fernando left the porch light on, and when we looked toward the road in front of the gate, there was someone standing there who gradually disappeared. Dona Celina, his wife, took a Bible and went out to the porch and began reciting some psalms. I remember Psalm 91 well. Then she said a prayer asking God to keep that thing away from their house. And God heard her, because the thing stayed in front of the gate. From inside the house, we heard horrible sounds, crying, screaming, howling, each one more terrible than the other. The most incredible thing was that while Keisha and I could barely stand from fear, Dona Selena showed an uncommon tranquility. I asked if she wasn't afraid, and she told me that anyone fears evil, but the God she serves is greater than anything, and therefore she knew that thing had no power to enter the property. They arranged a room for Keisha and me to spend the night, and incredibly, we managed to sleep peacefully. Early the next morning, Fernando knocked on the bedroom door and woke us up. They served us breakfast. I managed to call a tow truck, and afterward we returned to Riverside. But only then did I realize that I was actually on the Upland Highway, and not on the route that goes through Victorville, as I usually take. But the good thing was that we arrived safely in Riverside. That experience served to show me that evil is lurking, but that even evil fears the Lord God. After that night, Fernando and Dona Selena became friends, and I'll be grateful to them forever. What struck me most about that night wasn't just the supernatural encounter, but the incredible faith that family demonstrated. While we were paralyzed with terror, they remained calm and confident in their beliefs. Dona Selena's certainty that no evil could cross onto their property, protected by prayer and faith, was something I'd never witnessed before. The next morning, as we sat around their simple kitchen table sharing coffee and homemade bread, Fernando told us more about the strange occurrences on that stretch of highway. He explained that over the years, several travelers had sought refuge at their home after similar encounters. It's always the same pattern, he said quietly. People driving alone or in couples, usually late at night, and always involving a woman or female entity that seems to target vehicles. He paused, sipping his coffee thoughtfully. But here's what's interesting. No one who's made it to our house has ever been seriously harmed. It's as if something guides them here when they need protection. Dona Selena nodded in agreement. We've come to believe that we're meant to be here, to provide sanctuary for those who encounter whatever haunts that highway. It's become our calling, in a way. As we prepared to leave that morning, I couldn't help but notice how the property seemed to emanate peace and safety. The house was modest, but there was something sacred about it, a sense of divine protection that was almost tangible. Fernando walked us to our car, which the tow truck had brought to their property. Before we left, he placed a small wooden cross in my hand. "Keep this with you," he said, not as a superstition, but as a reminder that there are forces of good that are stronger than the darkness you encountered. During the drive back to Riverside, Keisha and I barely spoke. We were both processing what had happened and trying to make sense of it all. The rational part of my legal mind wanted to dismiss it as stress-induced hallucinations brought on by alcohol and fatigue. But I couldn't deny what we'd both experienced. And more importantly, I couldn't ignore the profound sense of peace and protection we'd felt at Fernando and Dona Selena's home. That wooden cross still sits on my desk at the law office, a constant reminder of that night when evil was held at bay by unwavering faith. And whenever I drive that route now, which I do occasionally to visit family, I always say a prayer as I pass that spot, grateful for the guardian angels who watched over us in our darkest hour. My name is Charles, and I grew up hearing stories that would make your blood run cold. My family came from the backwoods of Tennessee, way up in the mountains where the mist hangs low and secrets run deep. Most of the old folks have passed on now, but their tales live on, passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. There's one story that always stuck with me, told by my grandfather with such conviction that I knew it had to be true. You could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice, the way it trembled just slightly when he got to the scary parts. This wasn't some campfire tale meant to spook children. This was something he'd witnessed, something that had marked him for life. It all centered around a woman named Miss Jacinda, who lived up on Copper Ridge in the 1960s. She'd appeared in our hollow sometime around 1962. A stranger asking if anyone needed help with household work. Nobody knew where she'd come from, just that she seemed to be running from something. Old man Patterson, who raised goats up on the ridge, took her in as a housekeeper. She worked for him faithfully for 7 years, until he passed from a heart attack, leaving her a small plot of land as payment for her loyalty. That's when she built herself a little cabin way up high, where the road turned to dirt, and then to nothing but rocky trails through thick woods. Miss Jacinda became known as a healer of sorts. Folks would make the treacherous climb to her place when they needed help broken hearts, sick livestock, wayward children, or mysterious ailments that regular doctors couldn't cure. She had a way with herbs and roots, could read signs in tea leaves and bird flights, and always seemed to know things she shouldn't know. My great-grandmother went to her once, when my Uncle Billy went missing in the woods for 3 days. Miss Jacinda took a handful of mountain laurel leaves, breathed on them 3 times over a bowl of spring water, and told her exactly where to find him. Sure enough, they found Billy sleeping by Devil's Rock, dehydrated but alive, just like she said. But even though she helped people, there was something unsettling about Miss Jacinda. Hunters claimed she walked through the densest briar patches without getting a scratch. Wild animals didn't flee from her like they did from everyone else. And her eyes, people swore they changed color depending on who she was looking at, shifting from brown to green to something almost golden. Then there were the sightings of a massive snake in the area. Folks started reporting an enormous serpent, bigger than any rattler or copperhead anyone had ever seen. Some claimed it was 20 feet long. Others said it was as thick as a telephone pole and twice as long. The stories varied, but everyone agreed it was something unnatural. Old Pete Morrison, who lived at the base of the ridge, lost 2 of his hunting dogs one night. He heard them barking and carrying on something fierce, then just silence. When he went out with his flashlight, all he found were their broken chains and strange drag marks leading toward the upper trail. The person who finally saw the truth was a young man named Benedict, though everyone called him Benny. He was curious by nature, maybe too curious for his own good, and he'd always suspected Miss Jacinda was hiding something up in that cabin of hers. One moonless night in October, Benny decided to sneak up the mountain and see what she was really up to. He took the old deer trail that most folks had forgotten about and made his way to her place around midnight. There was an outcropping of rock behind her cabin where he could lie flat and peer through her back window. For the longest time, nothing seemed unusual. Miss Jacinda moved around her single room, muttering to herself as she sorted through jars of herbs and bottles of dark liquid. A kerosene lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls. Then she blew out the lamp and sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. That's when Benny heard it, a sound he'd never forget. Not quite a hiss, not quite a whisper, but something in between. A dry, scraping sound like scales against rough wood. In the moonlight filtering through the window, he watched Miss Jacinda begin to writhe on the floor. Her movements were slow at first, almost like she was in pain. Then her body began to change. Her legs seemed to fuse together. Her arms pressed against her sides, and her long gray hair spread across her back like overlapping scales. Benny swore he saw her transform with his own eyes, watched as she became something else entirely. A massive snake, thick as a man's torso and easily 15 feet long, with dark diamond patterns along her back and eyes that glowed red in the darkness. The creature coiled and uncoiled itself several times before slithering toward the window. Benny pressed himself flat against the rock, barely breathing, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might give him away. The snake paused at the window, its great head swaying back and forth as if sensing something, before sliding out the door and disappearing into the night. Benny didn't move for what felt like hours. When he finally worked up the courage to run, he crashed down that mountain like the devil himself was chasing him. He stumbled through the dark woods, tearing his clothes on branches and scraping his face on thorns, not stopping until he reached his family's farmhouse. He didn't sleep for days afterward. Couldn't eat, couldn't work, could barely speak when someone addressed him. His mother thought he'd been hexed, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He'd seen something that wasn't meant for human eyes, and it had shaken him to his very core. 2 years later, it was my grandfather's turn to witness the impossible. But unlike Benny, who'd gone looking for trouble, Grandpa stumbled onto something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. And that encounter, well, that's a story that deserves its own telling. Two years after Benny's terrifying encounter with Miss Jacinda, my grandfather had his own brush with the supernatural. But what he witnessed wasn't hidden in shadow or glimpsed through a window. It happened in broad daylight, clear as anything, leaving no room for doubt or denial. It was a Sunday in late spring, sometime around 1969. Grandpa had decided to spend the afternoon fishing at Willow Creek, about a mile downstream from Miss Jacinda's place. He liked to fish alone when he needed to think, and that particular Sunday, he had a lot on his mind. His youngest brother had just shipped off to Vietnam, and the weight of worry was heavy on his shoulders. He packed light, just his casting net, a canvas bag with some cornbread and jerky, and a mason jar filled with moonshine to keep the chill away. The walk to his favorite fishing spot took him along an old logging road that wound through stands of pine and oak, eventually opening up to a bend in the creek where the water ran deep and slow. Grandpa settled himself on a fallen log and cast his net into the dark water. The afternoon was peaceful, just the sound of running water and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. He'd been there about an hour, catching mostly small bass and bluegill, when he heard rustling in the bushes on the opposite bank. At first, he didn't pay it much mind. Could have been a deer coming down to drink, or maybe a raccoon washing its dinner. But then he saw her, a woman crouched by the water's edge, her back turned to him. She wore a faded blue dress and had long, graying hair that hung loose around her shoulders. A red bandana was tied around her waist like a sash. Something about her presence there struck him as odd. This wasn't a place where people usually came, especially not alone, and especially not a woman. But he minded his own business and kept fishing, stealing glances across the water every now and then. After a few minutes, the woman stood up and began arranging things on the ground around her. Grandpa could make out what looked like a small wooden mortar and pestle, a gourd dipper, some torn pieces of cloth, and what appeared to be chicken feathers scattered on a flat stone. She had a hunting knife stuck, point first, into the earth beside her. She lit a small candle and began to hum, not any tune he recognized, but something low and rhythmic that seemed to make the very air vibrate. As she hummed, she started to move, swaying back and forth with her arms raised like she was calling down something from the sky. Grandpa watched as she took the feathers and ground them up in the wooden mortar, then picked up the gourd and poured some dark liquid over her bare feet. The liquid looked thick and black, like molasses or blood. That's when the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy and still, like right before a thunderstorm. Even the creek seemed to quiet down. The woman's humming grew louder, more urgent, and she began to bend forward at an unnatural angle. She dropped to her knees, then to all fours, and that's when Grandpa heard the sound, a wet, crackling noise like green wood in a fire. He watched in horror as her back arched, and her spine seemed to reshape itself. The blue dress rode up, and he could see her backbone popping and shifting under her skin. Her feet disappeared first, seeming to meld together and elongate. Her hands pressed flat against the ground, and her fingers began to fuse and harden. In the space of maybe 30 seconds, where a woman had been kneeling, there now stood a large black goat. But this wasn't any ordinary goat. It was massive, bigger than any buck he'd ever seen, with muscles that rippled under its dark coat and eyes that burned red like embers. The red bandana was still tied around its neck, the only thing that remained of the woman who had been there moments before. The creature, because that's what it was, no longer anything natural, turned its head and looked directly at him across the water. Those burning eyes met his, and Grandpa felt a chill run through his body like he'd been struck by lightning. For a moment that lasted an eternity, they stared at each other across that creek. Then the goat thing took a step toward the water, as if it might cross over to where Grandpa sat frozen on his log. But something stopped it, maybe the running water, maybe something else entirely. Instead, it turned and bounded into the forest with movements that were too fluid, too quick for any earthly animal. Grandpa sat there for a long time after it disappeared, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't have cast his net if his life depended on it. The afternoon sun was getting low when he finally gathered up his things, left half his catch lying on the bank, because he couldn't bring himself to stay any longer. He walked home in a daze, his mind struggling to process what he'd seen. When he got back to the farmhouse, my grandmother took one look at his face and knew something terrible had happened. But he didn't tell her, not that night or for years afterward. He only shared the story with family, and even then only when pressed. He always ended the tale the same way, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. What changes shape changes soul. What walks on 4 legs when it should walk on 2 ain't natural, and it ain't right. I saw it with these old eyes, and I'll carry that sight to my grave. Miss Jacinda lived up on Copper Ridge for another 7 years after that day by the creek. People still climbed up to see her when they needed help, though fewer made the journey as time went on. Some said they'd lost faith in her abilities. Others whispered that they'd lost faith in her humanity. She disappeared one autumn night in 1976. Folks found her cabin empty, with no sign of struggle or preparation for travel. Her few belongings were still their clothes in the dresser, herbs hanging from the rafters, even money in a coffee tin on the mantelpiece. Some say she just walked away into the mountains and died alone, the way she'd lived. Others believe she shed her human form one last time and slithered away into the deep woods, where things like her belong. My grandfather never went back to that bend in Willow Creek. He found other places to fish, other spots to sit and think. But sometimes, on quiet Sunday afternoons when the mist hung low in the hollows, he'd get that faraway look in his eyes, and I knew he was remembering that day when the world showed him something it wasn't supposed to. My name is Theodore Anderson, but everyone who knows me calls me Ted. I work the night shift as a security guard at a gas station here in my small town in rural Montana. And I'm going to tell you about a terrifying experience I had with some friends about 16 years ago. As is common in small rural towns, our cemetery sits outside the town limits. Here in our little community, it's no different. The old Hillview Cemetery is located about 300 yards from the main entrance to town. Back in 2005, my friend Jake's father bought a gas station here in our town, and this station sits right at the town entrance, uncomfortably close to that old cemetery. Knowing about the job opportunity, I approached Jake, who was the owner's son, and told him about my situation. I asked if he could help me get work there. Jake promised to help me out, but the day shift attendants, office staff, and snack bar workers were already practically hired. The only position available was the night security guard, since the station would operate from 6 in the morning until 11 at night. At that time, my son had just been born, and I desperately needed steady work. Until then, I had been surviving by selling my labor day by day. But sometimes, there would be weeks when nothing much came up, and my wife and I found ourselves struggling financially. I didn't think twice. I immediately accepted the job, which would be on a rotating schedule. One night on, one night off. Mr. Valdez closed the station for about 3 months to do renovations, and as soon as the station reopened, I started working. In the beginning, it was pretty peaceful, since the town is small and there's little traffic at night. Sometimes I would spend the entire night alone without anyone stopping by the station. However, on certain days of the week, some truckers would sleep in their rigs in the station's parking lot. I had been working there for more than a year, and up until that point, I had never witnessed anything unusual. But in March of 2006, on a clear moonlit night around 11 o'clock, I was in the station's parking lot talking with some truckers who were planning to spend the night there. One of the truckers went to take a shower in a restroom located at the back of the station. After about 15 minutes, he returned and asked me if I had seen some people talking in the direction of the dirt road. I told him I hadn't heard anything and explained that the dirt road on the side of the station led directly to the town cemetery. Another trucker, who was also there chatting with us, said he hadn't heard anything either. In any case, I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the back of the station, then walked a bit down the dirt road. I didn't see anything or anyone around. I returned to the parking lot and stayed a while longer talking with them. But they eventually went to sleep, and I went into the little security booth. That night, nothing unusual happened, and the following night wasn't my shift. After another night passed, my turn came around again. Around 9:30 at night, I arrived for work, stored my motorcycle behind the station, and after 10 o'clock, all the other employees went home. Unfortunately, that night, there were no trucks parked in the lot. That night felt very strange because suddenly, a thick fog rolled in, making the temperature drop considerably. When I found myself alone with that mist taking over the entire parking lot, I got chills and an eerie feeling. I stayed inside the security booth more than outside in the lot, and after midnight, I heard voices that sounded like chanting, but as if it were a lament or someone suffering. I became intrigued by this, so I left my little booth, walked around the perimeter of the station, and saw nothing. There was certainly no one to be seen nearby. However, when I headed toward the dirt road, I saw a strange light that seemed to be coming from inside the cemetery. Since my job was to guard the fuel pumps, I didn't go to check what was happening in the cemetery, especially because I couldn't leave the station unattended. But that night was really unsettling, and the next day I told my wife what I had seen. She suggested it might have been some people from the church who had gone to the cemetery to pray for the souls. Given my doubts, this explanation seemed plausible, but I still had a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. That very night, even though it wasn't my work shift, around 10 o'clock at night, I took my motorcycle and went to the station. When I arrived, there were several trucks parked in the lot. I spotted my friend Leonardo, who was the other security guard working alternating shifts with me, talking with Mr. Ray, one of the truckers we knew, who practically every week spent a night at the station. When Leo saw me, he immediately asked what I was doing at the station at that hour, and if something had happened. I told him about what I had seen and heard the previous night. He thought I was pulling his leg, so Mr. Ray interrupted us and said, "Look, Leo, Ted isn't lying. I don't usually talk about certain things precisely because people generally don't believe them, and often we end up being called liars. But traveling these roads and sleeping in station parking lots, I've seen a lot of strange things, and I'll tell you that right here at this station. When it belonged to the previous owner, sometimes in the early morning hours I've heard a voice calling me, and when I got up and looked outside, there was nothing there." After Mr. Ray said that, Leo became concerned. In any case, we stayed there to see if something would appear that night. Around midnight, I heard the same noise as the previous night. So Leo, Mr. Ray, and I went to investigate, walking up the road that led to the cemetery. As soon as we started walking, we saw lights inside the cemetery. Since we were at some distance, we couldn't make out who was there. From a distance, it looked like there were normal people inside the cemetery carrying lit candles and walking among the graves. We approached carefully and slowly, creeping toward the wall. As we got closer, we noticed that although it appeared there were people in that place, there was actually no one there. What was there was something macabre. The creatures resembled corpses wearing old, tattered clothes and they were speaking words that I couldn't understand at all. Upon seeing that scene, Leo shouted, "Merciful Lord, what is that?" When he spoke, the creatures discovered us and turned toward where we were hiding. They then began walking in our direction. At that moment, we ran as fast as we could, and those things came after us. We reached the station, and again a fog enveloped everything around us. Mr. Ray woke up another guy who was sleeping inside the cab of a truck, and the four of us entered our security booth. About 5 minutes later, the creatures arrived at the station. They walked as if they were lost, not knowing where to go, but at the same time emitted horrible sounds that made my legs tremble. We began to pray and ask God to help us, and after several minutes, the fog began to dissipate and the noises stopped. However, one of the creatures remained there in the parking lot, until suddenly it headed toward the dirt road leading back to the cemetery. After that, I took my motorcycle and went home. When I got there, I told my wife everything. The next day, my friend Leo told me he had spent the night wide awake, without closing his eyes. That night, I went to work, but after that experience, I heard noises coming from the cemetery many times and also saw lights moving around. But I never dared to go there to see what was happening. As my wife says, I'm paid to guard the station, not the cemetery. This was my account of what happened at Crossroads Station, where the living and the dead seem to cross paths on foggy nights, and where some secrets are better left undisturbed. My name is Anthony Norwood. I'm 47 years old, and I currently live in Denver, Colorado. However, during my entire childhood and adolescence, I lived in a small town called Millfield, located about 60 miles from Boulder in the Colorado mountains. What I'm going to tell you happened in October of 1990, when I was 17 years old. At that time, I was studying in the morning shift, my junior year of high school. Usually after I got home from school, I would barely finish lunch before my brother Eric, who was 3 years older than me, and I would head to our family's ranch to take lunch to our father. Most of the time, we would stay there for the rest of the afternoon helping with the work, and we would only return home in the late afternoon. We went by ATV because it was very hot during the day, and on the way back, we would load it onto the bed of Dad's pickup truck and return with him. On a Friday, my parents and my younger sister traveled to Colorado Springs to attend a family reunion. But before leaving, Dad left Eric and me responsible for finishing cleaning a section of the potato field, putting soil around the base of the plants, feeding some pigs and chickens we raised, and also loading some grain sacks we had prepared and taking them to our house in town. The distance between our ranch and town was 8 miles, with 7 miles being unpaved mountain road with forest on both sides and no lighting whatsoever, and only 1 mile was paved highway. Around noon, Eric and I got home from school, had lunch. The food was already prepared and stored in the refrigerator. We just heated it up and fried some meat. We took advantage of the time to rest a bit and watch some TV. And when it was almost 2 in the afternoon, Eric and I went to the ranch. Once there, we spent the rest of the afternoon working. We cleaned the potato field, and when it was getting dark, we put food and water out for the animals. After that, we went into the grain storage building, took 3 heavy sacks full of grain, and loaded them onto our old mule, 1 on each side, and one on top to balance the weight. After finishing all the work, it was already quite dark. But luckily, it didn't take long for the moon to appear and quickly illuminate the mountain road. We walked calmly, leading the animal that moved slowly due to the weight it was carrying, talking and laughing. After walking for about half a mile, we heard a piercing sound. It seemed like a sharp scream that made my hair stand on end and my legs tremble. Immediately after, I heard the sound of beating wings. When I looked up, I saw flying over us a creature that looked like an owl, but it was disproportionately large. Actually, it looked more like a person. I was very scared, but my brother said it must be one of those great horned owls that are common in these mountains. Since we couldn't stay there on the road, we continued on our way, which was illuminated by moonlight. We walked a bit more until suddenly our mule balked and wanted to turn back. Neither Eric nor I could see anything strange ahead, and we tried every way to force the animal to keep moving forward. It was then that I saw, standing at the edge of the road, a creature that resembled a woman. I had never felt so much fear in my life. I pointed in that direction for my brother, and he also saw that thing. I didn't have the courage to continue forward, so we turned around and headed back. But at that moment, the creature again emitted that sharp sound, the same one we had heard minutes before. Desperate and not knowing what to do, and especially afraid of that creature, since the only weapon we had to defend ourselves was a hunting knife, we started running. But we couldn't abandon our animal there, in the middle of the road. It was then that I had the idea that instead of returning to our ranch, which was farther from where we were, I suggested we go to Mr. Jose Martinez's ranch, which was much closer. We quickened our pace and arrived in front of his gate, but it was locked, so we started calling for Mr. Martinez, asking for help. He came to the window, and we shouted desperately. Seeing our distress, Ricardo, Mr. Jose's son, quickly came with the key to the padlock that secured the gate. As soon as he opened the gate, we ran inside the house. We were pale with fear, trembling like leaves. Mrs. Alice went to the kitchen and brought us some water. We drank, caught our breath, and then calmed down and began to tell them what had happened to us on the road. Mr. Martinez asked about my father, but we explained that he had gone with my mother and our sister to the family reunion in Colorado Springs, and would only return later. He didn't say whether he believed us, but in any case, he took the grain sacks off our mule and put them in the bed of a pickup truck he had, and said he would take us to our house, and then we could come back for the mule. We went with him, but the truck had barely left the gate when we heard that scream again. Then Mr. Jose braked the truck abruptly. When I looked, there was a creature standing at the edge of the road that looked like a mixture of woman and owl. When he saw that, he finally believed us, but the shock was so great that he froze without any reaction. I think he couldn't believe that such a creature could exist. Suddenly, the creature began walking in our direction. I let out a loud scream, and only then did he come back to his senses and said, "Merciful Lord Jesus, what kind of hideous creature is that?" It seemed like he had come out of a trance or something similar. He quickly put the truck in reverse, and we returned rapidly to his ranch. As soon as we got out of the truck, we started running toward his house. Mr. Jose was as terrified as Eric and I were. He began shouting for us to quickly lock the windows and doors, and put on the security bars. Mrs. Alice wanted to know what kind of monstrosity he had seen. Even before Mr. Jose could say anything, we heard the creature's sharp scream again, and by this time it was very close to their house. Mr. Jose said there was a demon in the form of a woman outside. Upon hearing these words, Mrs. Alice ran and lit some candles in front of an altar with several Catholic saint images and began to pray. Without wasting time, Ricardo ran to the bedroom and got a shotgun, while Mr. Jose turned off the lights inside the house, leaving only the porch light and the yard light on, because that way it would be easier to see the creature outside. We remained silent because fear prevented us from even talking. At that moment, I feared the creature might enter the house and kill all of us. I started crying next to my brother, but Mrs. Alice, seeing my desperation, got up from where she was and stayed close to us, trying to calm us down. Suddenly, the creature came walking, looking like a woman, but with a nose resembling a bird's beak. Its arms looked like wings with claws at the ends. When it reached the porch, it began scratching at the front door. The claws were probably very sharp, and it knew we were inside. Desperate, but the worst was yet to come. Soon the roof began to shake. At that moment, we knew that thing was up there and would enter the house. Desperate to save our lives, Mr. Jose took the shotgun from Ricardo's hands, aimed it in the direction of the creature, and pulled the trigger. He certainly hit it because it let out a scream, flew off, and fell further ahead near the gate. Even with the creature wounded, we didn't have the courage to leave the house. But we opened the window slightly and watched from a distance as that creature writhed in pain. It rolled on the ground and tried to fly but couldn't. Then it looked right in our direction and tried to utter some words. Mr. Jose fired another shot. I don't know if he hit it, but the creature let out another very sharp scream. And after that, it ran down the road until it disappeared into the darkness. Fearing that creature might return and attack again, Mr. Jose called Mrs. Alice and Ricardo, and we all went to town. He spent the night at his brother-in-law's house. Eric and I stayed at our house, and when it was almost midnight, I heard the sound of a car horn. And when I looked out the window, my parents and sister were arriving from the family reunion. My sister immediately wanted to know if everything was okay with us. I said yes, but I found it strange that she asked, since neither Eric nor I had said anything about what had happened. Even before Eric and I could tell what had happened, she told us that during the afternoon she had felt a tightness in her chest and had a bad feeling that something bad was going to happen to me and my brother. We told her what happened on the ranch road. She began to cry with happiness that we hadn't been hurt, and then went to her room to thank God for our protection. The next day, my father and Mr. Jose armed themselves and went to try to see if they could find the creature. After searching through the brush, they found something very strange. A pile of white feathers stained with blood near a juniper tree, and several scratches as if some animal had clawed the tree. This was the only time the creature appeared in the region, but my father and Mr. Jose asked us to keep this secret for a long time, because they feared our families would be mocked by everyone in town. My father still has the same ranch, and Mr. Jose still lives in the same house. From time to time, I remember this story, but to this day, I have no idea what kind of creature that was. I also don't know if it died, or if it's still alive and haunting somewhere else. Some say it was a skinwalker. Others believe it was something that escaped from the old mining tunnels in these mountains. All I know is that there are things in these Colorado woods that are better left undisturbed, and some roads are safer traveled in daylight with plenty of company. Although it may seem difficult to imagine, there was a time when the campus of Cornell University didn't possess the gigantic proportions it has today. In the 60s, this institution was the central point of a small and charming university town, surrounded by the gentle hills of the Finger Lakes region in upstate New York, affectionately nicknamed Happy Valley. Back then, the local population was smaller than the current number of enrolled students, something almost unimaginable for today's students. It was in this setting that Betsy Arden enrolled at Cornell in 1969. At just 22 years old, she was a graduate student in English after completing her education at the University of Michigan, the state where she was born. Betsy was known for being intelligent, dedicated to her studies, and well-connected. She maintained a deep romance with David Wright, a medical student who, according to reports, was planning to ask for her hand in marriage that year. On November 28th, right after the Thanksgiving holiday, Betsy put on an elegant red dress and dedicated herself to working on a paper for one of her courses. The day went by quietly. She only took a quick break for lunch before heading to the library to continue her work into the early afternoon. The imposing building with great architectural beauty had an entrance adorned with columns that led to a broad pathway. Betsy spent the day focused on her work, even as the sun began to set behind the hills. Determined to finish the paper, she planned to continue studying late into the night. For unknown reasons, she was one of the few students who remained on campus during the holiday, leaving the area practically deserted that weekend. Silence reigned over the campus, and the nearly empty library reflected this quiet even more. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, Betsy decided to explore a section of the library known to students as the Stacks, a labyrinth of old, narrow corridors filled with books. In one of these isolated corridors, far from any company, Betsy was found later unconscious. A library visitor came across the young woman on the floor and alerted a staff member about the situation before quickly leaving the premises. The staff member rushed to Betsy and found her lying face down on the floor, surrounded by scattered books. Despite attempts to wake her, she didn't respond. He then called the emergency services. Paramedics arrived within a short time, facing the heavy traffic typical of the Thanksgiving holiday. Betsy was placed on a stretcher and taken to the nearby Rittenhouse Health Center. This happened at 5:19 in the afternoon, less than an hour after she had been found unconscious. Initially, the first responders believed Betsy had suffered a seizure or another medical complication. Her health condition, however, was rapidly deteriorating. Her blood pressure was dropping, and she had no pulse. Only at the hospital, during the examinations, did the doctors realize what had happened. Betsy had a single stab wound to the chest. The fatal injury that Betsy suffered was a single stab that hit her left breast, penetrating directly into the left ventricle of her heart. The location of the blow meant that blood didn't flow in large quantities outward. Most of it accumulated in her thoracic cavity. The little blood that escaped ended up blending with the red tone of the dress she was wearing, which led the paramedics to delay understanding the gravity of the situation and hesitate about the appropriate treatment. In any case, it's unlikely that the speed of the care would have changed the outcome. It's believed that Betsy died about a minute after being attacked by her unknown aggressor. Whoever attacked her was someone who either knew her or managed to approach her without being noticed, as besides the few books knocked down from the shelf, there were no signs of a struggle. Betsy's body showed no other injuries, scratches, or bruises, indicating she didn't have a chance to react. Additionally, no one reported hearing screams or any noise coming from the location of the attack. All that is known about the moment of the crime is that a mysterious man informed the reception staff that a woman needed medical help, and then left the library without being identified. There was no indication that the crime had motivations related to abuse or harassment. Her clothes were intact, and there were no signs that she had suffered any violence of that type. The attack seems to have been cold and calculated. The aggressor approached, delivered the stab with precision, and fled without raising any alarm. The stab also punctured one of her lungs, causing a blood buildup that made it impossible for Betsy to scream. Despite this, some experts argue that it would be difficult for an attacker to know exactly where to stab to ensure such a result, suggesting that the precision may have been coincidental, as happens in many murders. As happens in many murders in small towns, the crime generated a wave of dismay and sadness in the Cornell community. The population clamored for quick answers, but the investigations didn't advance. No murder weapon was found, and the only concrete clue was the report of the man who left the library after notifying about the emergency. He, however, was never identified, and investigations into Betsy's personal life didn't point to any close suspects. The police interviewed thousands of people, but couldn't obtain any significant leads. For the investigators, the crime could have been committed either by a random killer or by someone very close to the victim. Despite the lack of evidence, some questions stand out. First, Betsy had left the state of Michigan to live in New York precisely during the period when a student killer was active, and the decision seems to have been influenced by concern for her safety. Second, just as in the Sandusky scandal that would shake the university years later, the authorities seem to have prioritized preserving Cornell's reputation instead of efficiently investigating the case. Betsy's murder happened amidst the fervor of protests against the Vietnam War that took over university campuses across the country. The climate of distrust toward authorities, typical of the time, made the student body little collaborative with police investigations, considerably hampering the work of investigators and compromising any chance of significant progress in the case. Over the years, amateur detectives repeatedly pointed to the same name as the main suspect, Richard Hafner, a student on the night of the crime. Richard was staying at the house of one of his professors, and his background was disturbing. He was known for his explosive personality and for the habit of carrying a large knife with him, supposedly for self-defense. Curiously, the professor who hosted him kept these details secret for many years, until Richard violently threatened him when confronted about the incident. Despite this, Richard was never officially arrested or charged, and an important detail weighs against him. The man seen leaving the library right after the attack, considered by the police to be the main person responsible for the crime, was never identified as being Richard Hafner. Although Richard's aggressive behavior in previous situations places him as a natural suspect, there are reasons to question whether he was really the author of the crime. Betsy's murder was meticulously executed with a coldness and precision that didn't match Richard's impulsive and violent profile. This raises the possibility that another person might have been responsible for the attack. Richard died in 2002, eliminating any chance of formally interrogating him. If he was indeed the killer, the opportunity to obtain a clear confession was lost forever. Thus, Betsy's case remains unsolved, one more among so many crimes committed on American university campuses that never find an answer. The person responsible for this cruel and premeditated attack continued unpunished, free to walk the streets of New York for over 50 years. It could be someone ordinary, perhaps a neighbor, a person we see every day, or even someone unexpected, like a close relative. The sad reality is that we may never know who took Betsy's life. In the decades since Betsy's murder, Cornell has changed dramatically. The library where she was killed was renovated in the early 2000s. The old stacks, replaced with modern, open-concept study spaces bathed in natural light. Few students today know that a murder occurred there, though some claim to feel a sudden chill when studying late at night in certain corners of the building. Periodically, the case attracts renewed interest. In 1998, a journalism student wrote her thesis on the murder, digging through archives and tracking down aging professors and classmates who remembered Betsy. Her work uncovered an interesting detail. In the weeks before her death, Betsy had mentioned to a friend that she felt someone was watching her in the library. She dismissed it as paranoia from too many late-night study sessions, but in retrospect, it took on a more ominous tone. In 2015, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence preserved from the crime scene. A partial DNA profile was recovered from the handle of one of the books found near Betsy's body, a book that wasn't part of her research materials and appeared to have been placed there after the attack. The profile didn't match any suspects in the original investigation, including Richard Hafner, whose DNA was obtained from preserved medical samples. This new evidence suggests that Betsy's killer may have been someone entirely unexpected, perhaps even a stranger to the university community. The DNA profile has been entered into national databases, but so far, no match has been found. Some forensic psychologists who have studied the case believe the murder wasn't random, but highly planned, possibly by someone with a specific obsession with Betsy. The precision of the single stab wound, the lack of sexual assault, and the curious detail of the killer alerting staff to her condition all point to a complex psychological profile. As Betsy's classmates have grown old and many have passed away, the possibility of the case being solved through a deathbed confession or a witness finally coming forward grows increasingly remote. Perhaps the only hope now lies in that partial DNA profile and the possibility that someday, somewhere, the killer's genetic information will enter the system and reveal the truth that has remained hidden for over half a century. Until then, Betsy Arden remains a ghost in Cornell's history, a promising young woman whose life was cut short in a moment of inexplicable violence. A reminder that even in the most idyllic of academic settings, darkness can find its way in. Gabriella Hollins, at 41 years old, was working on the morning of March 10th, 1997, at the gas station located on Highway 80 in Dawson County, Nebraska. After a turbulent divorce, she was reorganizing her life while caring for her 2 children who remained in her custody. Promoted to manager just the day before, Gabriella was beginning to reap the fruits of her efforts. Those close to her described her as generous, friendly, and kind-hearted. The period after the separation had been particularly difficult, aggravated by the disrespectful behavior of her ex-husband. Still, she finally seemed to be regaining control of her trajectory. The new position at work brought a renewed sense of purpose and accomplishment. But around 10:30 in the morning, a red Pontiac Grand AM entered the gas station parking lot. Security cameras recorded the moment when the driver got out of the car, filled the tank, and entered the store. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary man, except for one detail that drew attention. He was barefoot as he entered the establishment. While he was coming in, Gabriella was attending to a customer, a mother accompanied by her daughter, chatting with them in a relaxed manner while finalizing the payment. The barefoot man remained at the back of the store, discreet, as if waiting for the 2 customers to leave. He picked up a can of soda, opened it, and began drinking, even staring directly at one of the security cameras. As soon as the mother and daughter left the premises, he walked calmly to the counter. There he pulled out a 9mm pistol and pointed it at Gabriella. Although the audio from the security cameras didn't capture his words, Gabriella's subsequent actions suggest that he demanded the money from the cash register. She handed over the cash, and he ordered her to lie down behind the counter. While she obeyed, the man began counting the bills handed over. Abruptly and without any apparent reason, he leaned over the counter and fired 3 times at Gabriella, who was on the floor. The shots were fatal, taking her life instantly. The barefoot man then calmly returned to his red Pontiac and left the location via the highway. The news of Gabriella's death devastated friends and family, who, despite the shock, hoped the case would be solved quickly. The evidence seemed solid. The man had looked directly at one of the cameras, providing the police with a clear image of his face. He was described as a Caucasian man, aged between early 30s and 40, with dark hair and eyes. The red Pontiac Grand AM used in the crime was quickly identified, but the lack of a front license plate and the high-speed escape made it impossible for the police to get any identification of the plate number. The bullets found at the scene were confirmed as 9mm, fired from a compact weapon. However, ballistic analyses showed no connection with other crimes known to the police. The barefoot man left a series of clear fingerprints from the gas pump to the counter, but to the investigators' frustration, none of them were registered in police databases across the state of Nebraska. Despite this, there was something about the way Gabriella was shot that indicated the case wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. One of the shots was directed at the back of her head, and the security images captured the man adjusting his aim to deliver the final shot. This suggested that the murder was premeditated and that the robbery could have been just a facade to cover up a planned homicide. The police made several appeals for witnesses or people with useful information to come forward, but the few clues obtained didn't lead to significant advances. The case gained even more notoriety when the security footage was shown on the famous television program, America's Most Wanted. Even so, no one was able to identify the suspect. The most plausible explanation at first glance was that the crime was a violent robbery committed by an itinerant criminal who needed money. The images reinforced this theory, showing a confident and methodical man in his actions, characteristics that pointed to a professional with experience in crimes of this type. The police believed this wasn't the barefoot man's first violent robbery, nor would it be his last. The crime also seemed to have striking similarities with other apparently random murders involving gas station employees, crimes that until that moment remained equally unsolved. While investigators tried to piece together the puzzle, uncertain about the true motives for the murder, one person was convinced they knew who was responsible. Jonathan Hollins, Gabriella's brother, didn't hesitate to point the finger at her ex-husband, Barry Rabinovitz. For him, the murder was a direct result of the turbulent divorce the couple had faced years before. Barry, the owner of a successful restaurant in the U.S. Virgin Islands, was a very wealthy man. When Gabriella decided to leave him, she secured a significant sum of money as well as substantial alimony, since she had retained custody of the children. Jonathan revealed that his sister had written a lengthy 16-page letter to her children during the divorce. The document explained the reasons behind her abrupt decision to leave her husband. In it, Gabriella reported years of suffering, detailing episodes of abuse, and describing the growing fear she felt due to Barry's explosive temper and violent nature. When he saw his sister featured on America's Most Wanted, Jonathan Hollins became obsessed with the details of the security footage. He was convinced that the barefoot man was a hitman from the Virgin Islands. In Jonathan's view, the habit of walking barefoot indicated that the suspect was someone accustomed to the tropical climate of the region. He believed that Barry Rabinovitz had hired this man to kill Gabriella, motivated by revenge for the money lost in the divorce and by the desire to regain custody of the children. Barry Rabinovitz passed away in early 2015 without ever being formally accused of involvement in Gabriella's death. Still, he was also never completely ruled out as a suspect. On the other hand, the barefoot man remains an enigma. He was never identified, located, or even linked to new clues. The evidence collected, fingerprints, ballistic data, and security footage, remains archived, while the case continues unsolved in the state of Nebraska. No new information has emerged in the 23 years that have passed since Gabriella's tragic murder. The mystery surrounding her death persists, fueling speculation from unsolved crime enthusiasts worldwide. However, there is a silent hope that one day new evidence will come to light and lead to the identification of the barefoot man, so that justice can finally be served. In the years since Gabriella's murder, her children have grown up and started families of their own. Her daughter Emily, who was only 12 when her mother was killed, became a prosecutor, driven by a desire to bring justice to victims like her mother. Her son Michael followed a different path, moving to the Virgin Islands himself in what some family members saw as a strange attempt to understand the place his stepfather had called home. The case received renewed attention in 2011 when a documentary filmmaker began researching a series about unsolved murders in the Midwest. The filmmaker discovered something curious 3 months before Gabriella's murder. A nearly identical crime had occurred at a gas station in Wyoming. The victim was also a recently divorced woman in her 40s who had just been promoted. The perpetrator in that case was also barefoot, though he drove a different vehicle. That case, too, remained unsolved. More disturbing still, the filmmaker uncovered that between 1995 and 1998, 7 gas station employees across 5 states were murdered in similar execution-style killings. All the victims were women between 35 and 45, and in 5 of the 7 cases, they had recently been through divorces. The filmmaker theorized this could be the work of a serial killer with a specific victim profile, rather than a hitman hired by Barry Rabinowitz. The FBI eventually established a task force to investigate these connected cases, but after 2 years of work, they couldn't definitively link them together. The barefoot man's fingerprints didn't match any in the growing national database, and no DNA evidence was ever recovered from any of the crime scenes. In 2019, a retired detective who had worked on Gabriella's case came forward with a startling revelation. He claimed that certain evidence had been deliberately suppressed during the initial investigation. Specifically, a torn piece of paper found in Gabriella's pocket with a partial phone number written on it. The number had a Virgin Islands area code. This revelation sparked a brief resurgence of interest in the Barry Rabinowitz theory. But without the man himself to question, the lead ultimately went nowhere. The current Dawson County Sheriff maintains that the case remains open and that any credible tips will be thoroughly investigated. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hollins has never wavered in his belief that his sister was the victim of a murder-for-hire plot. Now in his 70s, he still maintains a website dedicated to solving Gabriella's case, where he posts updates and theories. He's offering a $50,000 reward for information, leading to the identification and conviction of the barefoot man. Someone knows who this man is, Jonathan stated in a recent interview. Maybe it's a relative who recognized him from the footage, but was afraid to come forward. Maybe it's someone who overheard something in a bar years ago. All I know is that my sister deserves justice, and I won't stop until I find it. For now, the barefoot man remains one of America's most infamous unidentified killers. His emotionless face and strange lack of footwear, the only clues to his identity. And somewhere, perhaps, he still walks free, carrying with him the terrible secret of why he took Gabriella Holland's life on that ordinary March morning. On the morning after the Thanksgiving holiday in 2003, the Mountain Pines Retreat Center in Aspen, Colorado, rested in a tranquil winter landscape covered in snow. This serene environment, however, was drastically disrupted when the naked body of a young woman was discovered frozen near one of the cabins at the location. The young woman's name was Natalie Drew. She was 20 years old at the time of her death. Raised in the state of Ohio, she had moved to Florida to begin her university studies. During the summer of that year, she secured a temporary job at Mountain Pines, where a Christian youth camp event took place. It was there that she met her boyfriend, who worked at the center full-time. During the Thanksgiving holiday, Natalie decided to return to Colorado to visit him. Respecting the values of the location, the couple opted to stay in separate cabins. They spent the holiday together, enjoying romantic walks around the retreat grounds. Late in the evening of November 27th, after spending the day with Natalie, her boyfriend left her at her cabin around 11:30 and returned to his own lodging. The next morning, worried when he didn't see her at breakfast, he went to check on her. He discovered that she wasn't in her cabin and noticed bare footprints in the snow. The size and shape of the footprints indicated they belonged to Natalie. He followed them for about 600 feet to an area covered by trees, where he found her body lying in the snow around 8:50 in the morning. The young woman was completely naked. Her skin showed scratches and bruises, and her body was already rigid from rigor mortis. The scene was devastating for the boyfriend, who saw someone so dear to him in such a terrible condition. Sheriff Fred Johnson of Pitkin County stated that there was only one set of footprints in the direction of the body, ruling out the possibility of a pursuit before Natalie's death. He also mentioned that the steps appeared erratic, as if she had been disoriented before falling. The analysis suggested that Natalie had died shortly after entering the snow, possibly between 15 and 20 minutes after being left at her cabin by her boyfriend. An autopsy performed in Eagle County on November 30th indicated that Natalie was in perfect health before the incident. Pine needles stuck in her hair, dirt and scratches on her face and shoulders, plus the disorderly pattern of the footprints, suggest that she collided with trees while running barefoot through the snow. What would have led her to flee from her cabin in such a desperate manner remains a mystery. The injuries observed on Natalie's body included scratches that ran across her forehead, cheeks, neck, chest, abdomen, and legs. Additionally, there were small bruises located above the trachea, on the right cheek, and on the right side of the neck, as well as purplish marks on the left forearm, hand, and wrist. Despite these pieces of evidence, which the coroner attributed to contact with trees and bushes during a possible escape, there was no other visible damage to her body. Curiously, the autopsy also ruled out internal injuries to her brain, eliminating the possibility that hemorrhages or tumors had caused Natalie's strange behavior. Despite the detailed investigation, the exact cause of her death could not be determined. Sheriff Fred Johnson stated that although nothing indicated a crime, the case remained deeply enigmatic. "It's really very strange, but we're still hoping for something more conclusive," he declared. Leroy Bennett from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation corroborated the strangeness of the case, describing it as the most peculiar thing you've ever seen. Without definitive answers, the coroner was forced to list agitated delirium as the probable cause of death. Natalie showed no signs of narcotics or alcohol in her system, but 6 main factors led to this conclusion. The primary point was the fact that she was found completely naked, without signs of pursuit. Additionally, the absence of internal injuries and chemical substances ruled out more evident causes for her death. Another possible element was the impact of the altitude change. Coming from Florida at sea level, her adaptation to the rarefied air of the mountains could have provoked cerebral hypoxia. Elevated glucose levels in her urine also raised the hypothesis of hyperglycemia, which could justify the disoriented behavior. In the days following the tragedy, rumors and speculations about what had happened emerged. Natalie's boyfriend was the target of initial suspicions, as he was the last person to see her alive and the one who found her body. However, the young woman's family always defended his innocence and continues to believe that he had no involvement in her death. Another theory revolved around a possible eating disorder that Natalie might have been facing, suggesting that a cardiac arrest triggered by malnutrition had been responsible. Despite these theories, Natalie's death remains shrouded in mystery, fueled by numerous theories and hypotheses. Even without a definitive explanation, it's certain that she had no history of mental illness, drug use, or health problems until that fateful Thanksgiving weekend. In a sudden and unexplained manner, Natalie seems to have suffered a psychotic break. Just moments before, she had been perfectly fine, accompanied by her boyfriend to the guest cabin. However, in a short time, she had removed all her clothes and run through the snow-covered forest in the dark, at a speed so uncontrolled that she ended up colliding with tree trunks. The episode ended tragically, with her body being found just a few hundred meters from the cabin where she was staying. The situation is deeply intriguing and disconcerting, generating many more questions than answers. The diagnosis of agitated delirium provided by the coroner is particularly controversial. This condition is not officially recognized by institutions such as the World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric Association, or the American Medical Association, and therefore does not appear in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. In the United Kingdom, the Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody suggested renaming the condition as sudden death in restraint syndrome, highlighting that recorded cases usually occur in contexts where there is some type of restraint attempt. Given this context, it's reasonable to question the validity of this diagnosis in Natalie's case. If we discard it completely, however, we are left with an even greater void, without any explanation that allows us to understand how she lost her life. Did she encounter something or someone near the cabin that triggered such intense panic that it manifested as the supposed delirium? And if so, what could it have been? It's possible to imagine various scenarios. Perhaps she crossed paths with an intruder lurking in the darkness, whose presence awakened such visceral fear that it made her abandon any logic and run naked through the snow. Or maybe it was something even more frightening, a large, threatening wild animal that might have tried to invade the cabin, leaving Natalie with no choice but to flee desperately. Although the exact causes of this terror that night remain shrouded in mystery, there is one thing clear: we will never know exactly what happened to Natalie Drew. This case leaves us with an uncomfortable feeling of vulnerability, reminding us that in the blink of an eye, inexplicable events can transform lives, leaving those who remain bewildered, incredulous, and heartbroken. For years, the strange circumstances of Natalie's death have attracted the attention of both paranormal enthusiasts and medical researchers. The location has since become a minor pilgrimage site for those interested in unexplained deaths and mysterious circumstances. Dr. Helena Rosenthal, a neurologist specializing in altitude sickness, published a paper in 2012 suggesting that Natalie may have experienced a rare and extreme form of high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. She theorized that the combination of the sudden altitude change, possible dehydration from traveling, and the stress of the holiday might have triggered an unusual manifestation of the condition. What makes Natalie's case particularly puzzling is the rapid onset and the severe behavioral changes. Dr. Rosenthal wrote, "Typically, HACE develops over days, not hours, but there have been documented cases of extraordinarily rapid progression in susceptible individuals. The paradoxical undressing phenomenon, where hypothermia victims remove their clothing due to a sensation of burning heat caused by peripheral vasodilation, has also been suggested as a partial explanation for why Natalie was found naked. This behavior is well documented in hypothermia cases, though it doesn't explain why she left the cabin in the first place." In 2015, the case gained renewed public interest when a popular true crime podcast dedicated 3 episodes to investigating Natalie's death. The hosts interviewed her boyfriend, who had since married and moved to Washington State. He described the aftermath of finding Natalie's body as the most traumatic experience imaginable, and revealed that he had spent years in therapy dealing with survivors' guilt and trauma. "Not knowing what happened to her is what haunts me the most," he said during the emotional interview. "I've replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times, wondering if I could have done something differently. If I had stayed with her, would she still be alive? That question never leaves me." The podcast also revealed something that hadn't been widely reported. 2 other guests at the retreat that weekend had experienced unusual anxiety and disorientation, though neither to the extreme degree that Natalie had. This led to speculation about environmental factors, including the possibility of carbon monoxide leaking from the cabin's heating system, or an adverse reaction to a cleaning chemical used in the retreat's linens. Tests conducted after Natalie's death ruled out carbon monoxide, and no other significant environmental toxins were found. However, the fact that others experienced milder symptoms suggests something more complex than a purely psychological breakdown. Natalie's family established a scholarship in her name at her university in Florida, awarded annually to students pursuing degrees in elementary education, the field Natalie had been studying. They remain convinced that her death, while mysterious, was the result of a tragic medical event rather than foul play. "We miss her every day," her mother said at the scholarship's 10th anniversary ceremony. "We may never fully understand what happened that night, but we find peace in knowing she was happy in her final days, surrounded by the mountains she loved and the people who cared for her." As for Mountain Pines Retreat Center, they installed additional lighting around all cabins and implemented a buddy system policy where no guest stays alone in a cabin. The cabin where Natalie spent her final night has been repurposed as a storage facility. No one has slept there since that Thanksgiving weekend in 2003. During the Thanksgiving holiday of 1950, a northeastern storm was battering the coast of Massachusetts, hitting hard the small town of Marblehead in the vicinity of Salem. There lived Barrow Atherton, a 47-year-old elementary school teacher with a history of dedication to the profession that summed up a quarter of a century. Alone in her house on Sewell Street, she had only the company of Esky, her faithful white Spitz who had remained by her side since the loss of her father. Atherton, who considered herself a woman without close ties of friendship or family, spent her days in a reserved manner. Her favorite pastime was watching classic cinema, and she made solitary trips to a theater in Lynn to satisfy this passion. That Saturday, while cutting winds swept the neighborhood and the sky promised a relentless snowstorm, Barrow made her final preparations. Among her tasks, she visited the market to ensure the necessary provisions, including extra food for Esky. Later, around 6 in the evening, she went out to dispose of the trash. And at this brief moment, she noticed the attentive gaze of a young neighbor behind his house window. She waved gently to the boy, without imagining that this would be the last record of her living presence. For the next few days, the storm fulfilled its promise, and Marblehead was buried under the snow until Monday, November 27th, when the town began to return to routine. That day, the milkman, known as Pint, a habitual figure in the surroundings, went to Barrow's house to make his usual delivery. He would normally leave the milk at the door, but aware of the teacher's fragility, whose weight barely passed 100 pounds, he decided to knock on the door, concerned about the impact of the storm. He called once without response. He tried again, but the silence persisted. Instinctively, he turned the doorknob, noticing that the door was unlocked. He entered the house, calling Barrow's name, and upon reaching the kitchen, encountered a terrifying scene. On the floor, lying face down over a pool of coagulated blood, was Miss Atherton. Beside her, Esky, visibly injured, moaned in pain. Pint, overcome by shock, ran out toward a neighbor's house, calling for help and asking them to call the police immediately. When the authorities arrived, they found that Barrow had already been dead for several days. On the kitchen table, still intact, were the bags with groceries bought at the market, suggesting that the fatal attack happened right after her encounter with the neighbor boy, probably less than an hour after that gentle wave through the window. Barrow Atherton had her life cruelly interrupted. Barrow Atherton's body was found in a state that spoke of relentless and brutal violence. Fractured ribs and deep bruises around her neck indicated that she had been strangled with terrible force, to the point that the marks of the aggressor's nails were still visible on her cold skin. After the strangulation, her assailant used a small blade to cut her throat, but did so in an unusual manner. Besides a horizontal cut, a second vertical cut was inflicted, extending from the ribs to the chin, forming a grotesque cross. The cuts were so deep they almost decapitated her. The blood loss was so great that there were no traces in the blood vessels, forcing the coroner to extract a sample directly from the victim's heart. Before leaving, the aggressor attacked the small Esky, who tried to defend his owner, breaking several of the faithful dog's ribs. However, despite the barbarity, the crime scene revealed little about the culprit's identity. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nor footprints around the house. Even the neighbors, when questioned, couldn't offer any clues. No one besides Eski had seen the killer. If Barrow screamed for help, her pleas were probably muffled by the storm that roared that fateful night. Although the attack was grotesque and violent, there were few indications of a prolonged struggle. The only apparent sign of resistance was a broken necklace, shattered by the impact of the blade, and some of the victim's fingers fractured in a desperate attempt at defense. From all indications, the killer managed to surprise Barrow, approaching her without her perceiving the imminent danger. The lack of useful evidence at the crime scene raised the suspicion that the aggressor might have remained at the location for some time after the attack, carefully erasing any trace of their presence. Because it occurred in the kitchen, it's possible they used available cleaning products to eliminate fibers, fingerprints, and even traces of DNA. The discovery of a diary among Barrow's belongings brought an element of mystery. Although it revealed mentions of some male acquaintances, the content didn't provide sufficient clues to advance the investigation. Friends and acquaintances were surprised to discover she kept these records, as no one was aware of any recent romantic involvement. The diary mentioned a broken relationship that had left her deeply hurt, but even this didn't contribute to elucidating the case. With the police unable to point to suspects or clarify a clear motive, small Marblehead was overtaken by rumors. Some speculated that Barrow led a double life and had become involved with criminal activities in Boston, paying the price for it. Others believed a rejected lover had returned seeking revenge, or even that a relative anxious for an inheritance or fearing being excluded from it had committed the crime. The uncertainties and gossip only served to intensify the climate of tension and mystery that hung over the community. Despite the mystery surrounding the murder, the estate left by Barrow Atherton was modest, totaling about $5,000. No jewelry or valuables seemed to have been taken from the house, which weakened the hypothesis that the crime had a financial motivation. Still, there are those who live in Marblehead and claim to know exactly who was responsible for the brutal attack. A small group of people even claims that the murderer is alive, which, considering their age, probably nearing 80 or 90 years, suggests they may take this secret to the grave without ever facing justice. With the passage of time and the absence of new clues, all indications are that this barbaric crime occurred on a Thanksgiving weekend so distant will remain unsolved. Thus, a cold and implacable murderer seems to have escaped unscathed, free to continue their life, carrying the weight of the cruelest act a human being can commit, and the certainty that they will never pay for it. Years passed, and the case faded from most people's memories, but not from everyone's. Marblehead has transformed over the decades. Modern homes surround Barrow's former residence, which itself was eventually sold, renovated, and changed hands several times. Few of the current residents know its grim history. Detective James Mercer, now retired, kept a box of case notes in his attic for nearly 50 years. At 92, knowing his time was short, he invited a young true crime author to his home in the summer of 2020. "I never stopped thinking about her," Mercer told the author, his hands trembling as he opened the dusty cardboard box. "There was something about that case that never sat right with me, beyond the obvious brutality." Inside the box were crime scene photos, never released to the public detailed notes from witnesses long dead, and a small leather diary, Barrow's own, which had somehow never made it back to evidence storage. The most striking item, however, was a sealed envelope with theory scrawled across it in faded blue ink. The detective had maintained his own investigation privately after the official case went cold. His theory centered on a local physician who had treated both Barrow and her elderly father before his death. The doctor had been interviewed briefly during the initial investigation, but quickly eliminated as a suspect due to his standing in the community and seemingly rock-solid alibi. He claimed to have been attending another patient during the estimated time of Barrow's murder. Mercer had discovered, however, that the other patient had been heavily sedated and wouldn't have known if the doctor had left for an hour or more. More disturbing, he had found a pattern of similar brutal murders in other New England towns where the same doctor had previously practiced, all unsolved, all with female victims living alone, all with the same cross-shaped wound pattern. "I couldn't prove it," Mercer explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was too protected, too respected. The chief shut me down when I tried to pursue it. Said I was obsessed, seeing patterns that weren't there." The doctor in question died in 1973, taking whatever secrets he might have had to the grave. The true crime author published Mercer's findings in a book that became a bestseller, bringing renewed attention to Barrow's case. DNA testing on the diary's cover revealed partial fingerprints that didn't match Barrow's, fingerprints that couldn't be tested against the now-deceased doctor, but added weight to Mercer's theory. The cross-shaped wound, once thought to be random, was discovered to be a specific technique taught in certain European medical schools in the early 20th century, schools the doctor had attended in his youth. The residents of Marblehead now pass by the renovated house on Seawall Street with a different kind of awareness. Some claim to see a woman's silhouette in the kitchen window on snowy November evenings, or hear the faint whimpering of a dog. Whether these are just stories or something more remains, like so much about Barrow Atherton's case, a mystery shrouded in the past. I used to work at a place called Olson's General Store here in Whitefish, Montana. It was one of those traditional stores, a mix of warehouse and convenience store that sold a little bit of everything, from buckets and barrels to books and pocket watches, not to mention the usual groceries and alcoholic beverages. For a young person like me, it was a good job with generally cordial and well-intentioned customers. Of course, every now and then some persistent drunk would show up who would get irritated when I wouldn't sell liquor on a Sunday. But no one had ever threatened me with a weapon. However, that doesn't mean I haven't experienced situations that made me feel the presence of something greater. One of them happened on a Saturday night when I was working late, organizing the shelves and giving the store a general cleaning. Suddenly, the door opened, and a man walked in wearing an impeccable black suit. It was one of those that looked tailored, so well-fitted that they conveyed an air of sophistication, and to me, clearly indicated that he wasn't from the area. But the suit was the only thing that seemed normal about that guy. He had an extreme paleness, almost cadaverous, as if life had abandoned his face a long time ago. His features were incredibly striking, and his silver hair was impeccably slicked back. As soon as the doorbell rang, I went to the counter to attend to him, and when I faced him, he approached with a smile that seemed more predatory than that of a customer. He asked me for a can of lighter fluid. I went to fetch the item, trying to keep the conversation light while I rang up the purchase. I asked where he was from. "From Washington, D.C., he replied naturally. "Just passing through," I returned a polite smile. "Politics, I imagine." He gave a vague response, something along those lines. Then he took out a wad of cash like I had never seen before, full of $100 bills, and left one on the counter. While I was returning the change, I commented half-jokingly that it had been lucky the store was busy that night, because otherwise he would have taken all my change. I thought he would laugh or at least smile, but he remained impassive. Calmly, he pulled a Zippo lighter out of his suit pocket. It was the most gleaming lighter I had ever seen, seemingly silver-plated, and began to fill it right there in front of me. I had seen many of these lighters, but never one that looked so expensive. I imagined he was preparing to smoke something special and commented on this, to which he responded in an unexpected way, saying he didn't smoke. The moment he finished filling the Zippo, he accidentally dropped some fluid on his finger before closing the lighter. He brought the finger to his mouth and sucked the flammable liquid as if it were artisanal wine. I was paralyzed, unable to believe what I had just witnessed. I took a step back instinctively, and he noticed. In response, he gave me another one of those sinister smiles, as if he took pleasure in making me uncomfortable. I was about to ask what the hell that was when the doorbell rang again. I looked at the door and saw a girl enter who didn't seem to be more than 14 years old, about the age of my younger sister. However, the way she was dressed was much more childish, as if she were much younger. She wore a denim skirt decorated with white flower embroidery, something that seemed more appropriate for a small child. As soon as she entered, she called the man in the suit Papa, which led me to conclude she was his daughter, and asked to use the bathroom. The man then turned to me and politely asked if there was a bathroom available for her. I took the bathroom key that we had inside the store and handed it to him, but instead of passing it directly to the girl, he took something from his pocket, a small leather pouch similar to a wallet, and gave it to her along with the lighter and the key. Without saying anything more, the girl went to the bathroom and closed the door behind her, locking it. A profound uneasiness began to grow within me. There was something strange about the entire situation. The small leather pouch he had given her made me uneasy. I had an idea of what might be in there, but it was just a hunch, and I didn't have the courage to confront him about it. Besides, the two didn't look alike at all. The girl had a delicate, round face with very curly hair, while the man had sharp, marked features, so defined they seemed carved with a knife. And that Papa she used when referring to him seemed so out of place for a girl of that age. It would be more natural to call him Dad or something similar, but not Papa in such a childish way. Trying to ignore the discomfort, I made conversation to divert the focus. I asked where he and the girl were heading. "You're very curious, aren't you?" he responded, his voice losing the polite tone it had before. Instead, he began to stare at me intensely. His eyes were such a dark brown, they almost seemed black. Those eyes caused a shiver to run through me. They had something cold, empty, as if they didn't carry any human emotion. Just trying to be polite, I responded, shifting uncomfortably behind the counter. You know what they say about curiosity, don't you? He retorted in a low, almost whispered voice, without any trace of warmth or feeling. Curiosity killed the cat. After that, he turned and began to walk through the aisles, looking at the products with an air of someone evaluating antiquities from a forgotten village, which, thinking about it now, our store actually was. I returned to work, or at least tried to. I cleaned the shelves automatically, but without taking my eyes off him. I thought it wouldn't take long for the girl to come out of the bathroom, and he would continue on his journey. But the minutes passed, 5, 10, and she didn't appear. I was about to ask if he thought something had happened when I heard the sound of the bathroom lock being unlocked. The door opened slowly, but no sound came from there, not even the sound of a flush, which would be expected if she had been using the bathroom for its intended purpose. When the girl came out, she seemed dazed, almost as if in a trance. She walked up to the man in the suit and returned the key, the lighter, and the leather pouch with slow gestures. Her voice came out soft, sleepy. "Thank you, Papa." But there was something in the way she spoke that made me absolutely certain that man was not her father. The word came out loaded with something wrong, something dark. And the look he gave her was a look that no father should, under any circumstances, give to a daughter. It was a look that made me nauseated, and at that moment, I knew I needed to get them out of my store as soon as possible. Where I'm from, we're rarely direct to the point. We prefer to say something that has meaning between the lines, if you know what I mean. "Have a good journey now," was what I managed to say to the man in the suit, in a tone that sounded friendly. However, my look conveyed the opposite, loaded with suspicion. He stopped, turned slowly, and stared at me with a disconcerting intensity, as if he were evaluating me, ready to pierce me with that predatory gaze. Without breaking eye contact, he approached the counter, placed the bathroom key on it, and said with a disturbing calmness, "Never forget, young man, curiosity killed the cat." Without another word, he turned, went to get the girl, and the two left the store, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I seriously thought about calling the sheriff as soon as they left, but what could I say? That a man was traveling with a girl who appeared to be his daughter. There was nothing explicitly suspicious about that, at least nothing that could be proven. I could mention the leather pouch he had given her, and say I had a bad feeling about its contents, but I was certain that nothing I said would be enough to incriminate him. That figure exuded money and power, and the look he gave me left no doubt that he knew it. So I stayed silent. I didn't tell anyone anything. However, for the rest of my shift that night, and for several days afterward, his words didn't leave my mind. Whenever the memory of that scene came back, I heard his cold voice echoing with clarity. Curiosity killed the cat. Before going to the next shift, I mentioned the incident to my manager, trying to be casual about it. Had a weird customer the other night. Man in a fancy suit with a young girl. Something felt off about them. My manager raised an eyebrow. "Suit guy. Dark eyes, silver hair. Creepy vibe," I nodded, surprised. "You've seen him once or twice. Always with different girls." He lowered his voice. "I reported him to the sheriff after the first time. Nothing came of it. Said without evidence they couldn't do anything. But the leather pouch. The lighter," I asked. "Look, kid," he sighed. This town sees all kinds passing through. Unless we catch someone in the act, it's just suspicion. And suspicion isn't enough. 3 weeks later, I was working the night shift again when the local paper caught my eye. A small article on page 3 reported that a girl's body had been found near the highway, about 50 miles south of town. She was estimated to be 14 years old. No identification. She'd been missing for approximately 2 weeks before being discovered by a hiker. The description matched the girl I'd seen that night. Curly hair, small frame. The article mentioned she'd been found wearing a denim skirt with white flower embroidery. I called the sheriff's office immediately. When I explained what I'd seen that night, the deputy who took my statement seemed skeptical at first. But when I mentioned the embroidered skirt, a detail that hadn't been published, his tone changed. "We'll need you to come in and make a formal statement," he said, suddenly all business. "Can you identify this man if you see him again?" "Absolutely," I replied. "I'll never forget his face." They created a composite sketch based on my description, which was circulated to law enforcement agencies across several states. 6 days later, I received a call from the sheriff himself. "We might have something," he said. "There's been a series of similar cases, young girls gone missing, then found days or weeks later. Always near highways, always with certain similarities in condition." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The FBI is involved now. They want to talk to you." 2 agents came to interview me the next day. I told them everything I could remember: the man's appearance, his mannerisms, the leather pouch, the way he drank the lighter fluid, the girl's trance-like state when she emerged from the bathroom. The female agent exchanged a glance with her partner when I mentioned this last detail. "We believe this man may be connected to at least 7 cases across 5 states, she explained afterward. "The girls are all given drugs, usually in bathrooms of rest stops or stores like yours. They're kept compliant for several days before. She didn't need to finish." I understood. They set up surveillance at our store for 3 weeks, hoping he might return to his hunting ground. He never did. But my description led to his identification through security footage from other locations. A truck stop in Idaho, a gas station in Oregon, a diner in Washington. The man's name was Edmund Farley, a former pharmaceutical executive who had made millions before taking early retirement. He had homes in D.C., Florida, and overseas. No criminal record. Respected member of his community. Widowed with no children of his own. It took 8 months before they finally caught him. He was attempting to lure a young girl at a mall in Spokane. When they searched his car, they found the leather pouch containing various sedatives, zip ties, the silver Zippo lighter, and detailed maps marking remote locations across the Northwest. The FBI agent called to tell me the news. "We wouldn't have identified him without your statement," she said. "The detail about the lighter fluid was key. It's part of his ritual. He'd make the girls watch him drink it before." She paused. "Well, we found videos. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. When Farley's case went to trial, I was called to testify. As I took the stand and faced him across the courtroom, he stared at me with those same empty eyes. There was no anger, no fear, just that same cold, calculating gaze I remembered. As the prosecutor questioned me about that night, I could see Farley's lips curve into that familiar, predatory smile. When I finished my testimony and was about to step down, he whispered something just loud enough for me to hear: curiosity. The trial lasted 3 weeks. They found evidence connecting him to 11 murders spanning nearly a decade. He was sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. I still work at Olson's General Store, though not the night shift anymore. I can't shake the feeling that if I had acted sooner, if I had trusted my instincts, and called the sheriff that very night, that girl with the curly hair and the embroidered skirt might still be alive. Sometimes when I'm closing up, I think I see a tall figure in a black suit standing in the shadowy corner of the parking lot. But when I look again, there's nothing there. Just darkness. I've learned to trust that feeling in my gut when something seems wrong. I've also learned that some kinds of curiosity, the kind that makes you speak up when something feels off, can save lives. The cat might have died, but silence kills too. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.